the drip-black aisles of Hive Tertius Manufactorum, augmetic arms stitch artillery shells in perfect rhythm, while vacant eyes stare at nothing. The hands move with mechanical precision, each motion calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Lips move silently, not prayer, but cooling vents cycling stale atmosphere through modified respiratory systems. The sound mingles with the industrial hymnal of conveyor belts and hydraulic presses that never sleep. These are servitors. Once they were citizens bearing names and fears, and the small dignities of human consciousness. Now they are inventory, catalogued by function and maintenance schedule, their minds scooped hollow and refilled with task protocols that loop endlessly until death claims them. The Imperium runs on broken minds in stolen bodies, transforming citizens into property through bureaucratic ritual as methodical as any assembly line. The scale defies easy comprehension. On major hive worlds, 1 in 8 registered workers is no longer legally human. In Sector Gamma alone, 17,000 servitors maintain the munitions lines that feed the eternal war machine. Each represents a life extracted, processed, and repurposed according to the cold mathematics of imperial necessity. The taxonomy reveals itself through observation. Menial conveyors shuffle between stations with heavy-gauge lifting arms, grafted where shoulders once carried the weight of choice. Their spines curve under augmetic burden, vertebrae fused to support loads no human frame was meant to bear. Above the production line, lumen crawlers drag their blind bodies along heavy cables, sensing power draw with insect logic, while their modified limbs reposition light panels in the perpetual twilight. Gun servitors sleep in alcoves along the perimeter walls, their weapon arms locked in standby position until activation codes wake their machine spirits to violence. The tech adepts who oversee this flesh machinery speak of efficiency and sacred function. They recite catechisms about the weakness of flesh and the strength of steel, but their ledgers tell a different story. Each servitor represents a solved problem in the great equation of imperial logistics. Labor shortages become procurement quotas. Dissent transforms into compliance through surgical intervention. The economics are elegant in their brutality. 2 questions thread through every observation, unspoken but persistent. Who decides which bodies vanish into the system of sanctified erasure? The selection process operates through channels both official and shadow, guided by documents that carry the weight of law and the finality of execution. Magistrates weigh sentences while quotas whisper in their ears. Debt collectors calculate commutation rates. Medical officers diagnose cognitive unfitness with remarkable consistency during periods of increased demand. The second question haunts the recycling yards that ring every major manufactorum. What happens to the remains when function ends? The Imperium wastes nothing, least of all the raw materials that once walked and spoke and dreamed. Reclamation protocols ensure that death serves the machine as faithfully as life. But the specific rituals remain administrative mysteries, filed in archives few are authorized to access. Between these questions lies the bureaucratic artifact that makes the entire system possible. Sigil Grey/Omega appears on authorization documents throughout the imperial hierarchy, a simple stamp that transforms legal persons into biological resources with the finality of a falling blade. It appears on medical assessments, discovering sudden cognitive deficits on judicial sentences, providing reduction instead of execution, on procurement orders specifying cortex compatibility requirements, alongside standard industrial materials. The stamp carries no ornate heraldry or Gothic flourishes. It is a utilitarian mark designed for rapid application across thousands of documents. Its simplicity masks its function as the linchpin of systematic dehumanization, the bureaucratic instrument that makes atrocity administrative. Those who wield it rarely consider the weight of its application, but families who receive notification letters understand its meaning with perfect clarity. In the manufactorum's maintenance sector, a tech adept moves between servitor stations with ritual chalk, marking purity runes on foreheads and jawlines according to sacred protocols recovered from Mars. The symbols are precise, each stroke measured according to ancient templates. The servitors do not respond to the touch, cannot read the marks being inscribed upon flesh that no longer belongs to the person it once housed. The chalk sighs across bone with a sound like ash. The jaw flexes as cooling fans cycle. It looks like a nod, but means nothing. Everything here prefers to mean nothing. The tech adept's knuckles are stained grey where the stamp's ink splashed days ago. He does not mention it. We do not ask yet. The chalk dust settles on skin that cannot feel its blessing, each particle a microscopic testament to the bureaucratic machinery that transforms flesh into inventory. The ink on the tech adept's knuckles dries to a flake and becomes a line in a ledger. The line becomes a category. Categories become law. Under the twin pillars of imperial jurisprudence, lex imperialis and lex mechanic, servitors occupy a legal void between person and property, defined as lobotomized cyborg laborers, maintained for industrial function, and classified as chattel assets subject to requisition, transfer, and disposal according to operational necessity. This classification strips away every protection once afforded to the human substrate. Servitors cannot own property, enter contracts, or testify in judicial proceedings. They possess no right to medical care beyond maintenance protocols, no claim to wages beyond the energy required for function, no legal recourse against modification or termination. The law treats them as sophisticated tools that happen to be constructed from human materials, a distinction that proves crucial when examining how the system perpetuates itself through institutional momentum rather than individual malice. To measure what that legal transformation sets in motion, this investigation follows 4 analytical threads that reveal the complete machinery of institutional dehumanization. Production chains trace how raw human material flows through processing centers to emerge as functional units catalogued by serial number and task specification. Control mechanisms examine the technological and administrative systems that ensure compliance through neural binding and bureaucratic oversight. Survival economies map the grey markets and informal networks that emerge around servitor labor, creating secondary systems of exploitation and adaptation. Spiritual costs measure what communities lose when neighbors become property, and families learn to mourn the living while celebrating their continued function. The war economy's appetite operates according to precise metrics that treat human consciousness as a renewable resource extracted through quarterly requisitions. Forge worlds submit procurement requests specifying their needs for cortex-compatible biological units alongside demands for steel ingots and promethium shipments. Mars alone processes 12,000 conversion requests per standard year, with surge capacity reaching 18,000 during major campaign preparations. A middling forge world in the Meridius subsector requests 8,000 units per quarter for menial labor and maintenance, plus 500 for armed security applications. The mathematics are cold but consistent, allowing logistics officers to predict labor shortages and submit procurement requests with actuarial precision. Failure rates tell their own story of industrial efficiency applied to human material. Average first-year attrition, where failure means irreversible drift from task loops or catastrophic tissue breakdown, hovers between 11 and 15%, spiking during tithe accelerations when maintenance litanies are shortened to meet quotas. 30% of procurement candidates prove unsuitable for neural binding, their brains too damaged by trauma or disease to accept augmetic integration. These casualties disappear into biomass recycling systems, their protein content redirected to ration production with the same systematic thoroughness that processes their successful conversions. Replacement schedules operate on industrial timelines that measure human durability in operational hours. Standard menial servitors maintain peak efficiency for approximately 18 months before cognitive drift compromises task performance, though environmental factors can accelerate degradation. Lumen crawlers average 9 months due to corrosion exposure in ventilation systems. Gun servitors face the highest attrition rates, averaging 8 months of service before neural degradation requires either extensive reconditioning or disposal. The system budgets for these losses in advance, treating human consciousness as a consumable resource with predictable depletion rates. 4 primary institutions coordinate this extraction system, each contributing specialized capabilities to the overall machinery while maintaining bureaucratic distance from moral responsibility. The Adeptus Mechanicus provides technical expertise for neural binding and augmetic integration, treating servitor creation as sacred ritual that purifies weak flesh through mechanical improvement. Their forge temples house the surgical theaters, where citizens undergo reduction, emerging as sanctified tools blessed by the machine god. The administratum manages body levies through penal schedules that transform legal sentences into procurement quotas, ensuring steady supply flows to meet industrial demand through careful manipulation of criminal justice timelines. The ecclesiarchy frames punishment as penance, convincing communities that servitor conversion offers spiritual redemption for the condemned, while providing practical labor for the faithful. Planetary governors occupy the crucial interface between imperial demand and local supply, translating production deficits into arrest quotas with bureaucratic efficiency that obscures the human cost through layers of administrative abstraction. Control extends beyond legal classification into the physical architecture of obedience. Edict Theta 9/12, commonly called the Cortex Leash Compliance Mandatum, requires that all manufactoria and public work sites broadcast fail-safe liturgy at the striking of shift bells. The liturgy is not metaphor, but engineered compulsion, a patterned vox signal encoded with binharic instructions that refresh neural leashes, clear aberrant loops, and reaffirm task blessings. The system promises perfect worker compliance through technological control, but depends entirely on uninterrupted power supply and regular maintenance. If the grid dips or a bell is missed, If a cable is cut or an overseer is late, the units hold fast to the last command they received. They do not improvise. They persist. The edict's language emphasizes continuity of production and minimization of civilian panic during disturbance events, as if obedience were a feature granted by piety rather than firmware installed in living skulls. Around these mechanisms of control grows a secondary economy designed to purchase complicity from those left behind. The allotment scrip system issues payments to registered next of kin for each servitor consigned to a roster, creating economic incentives that transform grief into dependence. The scrip is redeemable for ration upgrades, medical priority, or cold season heating chits, calibrated to uptime bands and maintenance compliance records. A clean unit with 98% function earns more than a unit with corrosion warnings and deferred maintenance. The system teaches families to pray for efficiency and for a loved one's continued absence from their lives. A widow in level 43 receives her first scrip in a packet that smells faintly of oil and industrial solvents. The letter offers condolences in formal clauses, citing relevant lex entries, then itemizes the benefit: 700 ration credits per cycle contingent on maintenance data, affixed to Unit 43-17M. Her husband's designation is a number now, his heartbeat converted to a productivity metric tracked in quarterly reports. She stares at the place where his name would be and signs the loyalty affirmation with a hand that does not quite hold steady. The document reads like gratitude, but functions as enforced silence, voiding benefits for complaints or public lament, while triggering administrative audit for expressions of grief deemed disruptive to community morale. Across the corridor, another door remains shut. That family has refused the scrip on principle, or perhaps on rage that has not yet been ground down by necessity. Their file grows thicker and grayer with each administrative review. There are clinical terms for refusal: uncooperative, disruptive, potentially seditious. The consequences unfold through bureaucratic channels that prefer indirect pressure to overt coercion, creating conditions that make acceptance inevitable while preserving the fiction of voluntary compliance. The system operates through institutional incentives that reward efficiency and punish moral qualms, creating pressure that flows downward through every administrative level until it reaches individual families facing impossible choices. When Forge Worlds request additional servitors, governors review criminal dockets for suitable candidates with remarkable consistency. When labor shortages threaten tithe fulfillment, magistrates discover sudden increases in cognitive unfitness diagnoses and debt court violations that provide legal justification for procurement quotas. Each department maintains its own purity by assigning the unclean remainder to its neighbor, creating a conspiracy of willful ignorance that protects participants from examining their role in systematic dehumanization. To understand how this machinery achieved such bureaucratic perfection requires examining its origins in precedent and crisis, in doctrines argued in data vaults and sanctuaries, where emergency measures evolved into permanent policy. The documents that codify this institutional forgetting did not appear fully formed, but grew from fragments of treaties and rulings that once spoke of rehabilitation and mercy, but now authorize reduction and procurement with the weight of sacred law. The edict's authorship is attributed to a magos collegia, lost in footnotes and honorifics, But names have a way of surfacing when their consequences cascade through manufactorum flaws in green emergency lighting. The script that buys silence also creates records, and records reveal patterns that administrative oversight prefers to keep buried in archive vaults, where few are authorized to ask uncomfortable questions about the price of imperial efficiency. We will find that name. We will trace the engineering of obedience back to its source and examine what happens to families who refuse the offered compensation for their transformed loved ones. The answers lie in the historical foundations that sanctified this system, in the councils that turned salvaged technology into sacred law, and the minds that decided flesh was weak enough to be improved through systematic violation of everything that once made it human. The name we seek hides in the older strata of law, where medical caution became doctrine and mercy transformed into machinery. The archives beneath Mars hold fragments of a different age, when the technology that creates servitors served a purpose that would horrify its modern practitioners. Before obedience was engineered into flesh, the Mechanicum recovered fragmentary standard template construct data from the ruins of Terra, schemas for neural rehabilitation prosthetics designed to restore cognitive function to trauma victims during the dark age of technology. The original templates describe compassionate intervention, cranial scaffolds to bridge damaged synapses after combat trauma, limb augments linked to motor cortex rehabilitation routines, and therapeutic interfaces that pulsed patterned stimuli to guide memory restoration. There is no liturgy in these files, no mention of control or compliance, only diagrams, dosage ranges, error tolerances, and the careful mathematics of healing broken minds. The designs speak of hope offered to soldiers whose consciousness had been shattered by the horrors of old night, technology that rebuilt rather than destroyed the essence of human awareness. Across the age of strife, siege and scarcity taught different lessons. The same interfaces that soothed and steadied could also bind and flatten. Machine priests facing constant assault from techno-barbarian warlords discovered that therapeutic pulses could suppress higher-order cognition while preserving motor function. It began as emergency triage during the siege of Olympus Mons, when Martian defenders needed absolutely reliable warriors who could not be turned by fear or bribery or appeals to conscience. Tech adepts modified captured prisoners using adapted therapeutic protocols, installing neural control systems that replaced chaotic aggression with mechanical precision. The converted warriors fought with inhuman efficiency, immune to pain or terror, or the psychological warfare that had broken so many human defenders. Mars survived the siege, and its leaders drew conclusions about the utility of absolute obedience that would echo through the millennia. The term changed with the application. Therapy became leash. The Binharik, cadence that once coaxed lost memories home, hardened into a compliance pattern designed to prevent rather than restore independent thought. When the Emperor crossed the void, and the Treaty of Olympus Mons sealed the pact between Terra and Mars, a line of annexes acknowledged the Mechanicum's sacred autonomy over flesh-machine integration. Buried within those annexes, scholars trace the first formal blessing of reduction rites, the ritual by which a citizen's cognition could be paired to functional kernels and yoked to augmetics in the name of collective survival. The treaty language speaks of purification through steel, of weak flesh finding strength through mechanical guidance, of the blessed union between human consciousness and machine logic. It reads like a concession granted to compassion, presenting the technology as gift rather than weapon, as mercy rather than violation. In practice, the treaty authorized the conversion of deficits into capacity, establishing Mars as the sole authority for neural binding technology, and creating a monopoly that would prove crucial as the Great Crusade expanded across the galaxy. Each Forge world received sanctified templates and training protocols that presented systematic dehumanization as sacred duty, transforming what might have been viewed as abomination into sacrament through careful manipulation of language and precedent. The doctrinal councils of M31 through M33 codified these practices into imperial law during a period when emergency measures became permanent policy through bureaucratic momentum and institutional convenience. The conclave of Ceres affixed sacred form to the cortex leash, declaring patterned signals to be liturgy rather than instrument. The Synod Reductor argued that personhood depends upon the faculty to choose, which the rite of reduction intentionally removes. Therefore, post-reduction entities cannot possess legal personhood. The Council of Nicaea established precedent for restricting dangerous technologies to authorized practitioners, while the Synod of Gehenna declared consciousness itself a gift from the Emperor, subject to reallocation according to imperial need. Administratum jurists arrived late, but left fingerprints everywhere. Their memoranda, first labeled surplus mind asset utilization during resource crises, reframed the right as a budgetary mechanism that treated human consciousness as a strategic resource to be managed like any other imperial asset. The phrase appears sparingly at first, then acquires citations, then becomes a section heading in procurement manuals that establish quotas and timelines, efficiency metrics and quality standards, all couched in administrative language that obscures the human cost through layers of bureaucratic abstraction. In these debates we find the prototype for the edict that now governs Manufactoria. An obscure paper in the Collegia Theta Corpus proposes regularized broadcast of stabilizing patterns to ensure continuity of function and reduce panic during civic disturbances. Its author, name truncated in transmission, but fingerprints preserved in marginalia, never mentions servitors directly. He writes about crowds, about throughput, about maintaining order through technological intervention. The cadence evolved, the equipment scaled, and the edict that now bears the theta mark hardens those early proposals into non-negotiable practice. We will return to that hand when the green light fails and his theories face their ultimate test. Lawmakers anticipated objections that now sound naive. They inserted clauses for voluntary submission, seemingly humane options by which citizens might choose reduction in place of execution or terminal illness. The language presents this as humanitarian relief for those facing death or penal servitude, but the practical requirements expose the fiction. Voluntary submission demands sponsoring patrons from the nobility or merchant classes, individuals with sufficient social standing to vouch for the applicant's sincerity and provide financial surety for the conversion process. The clause requires connections and wealth, the two resources that reduction pretends to equalize by placing everyone beneath steel. In the Habstacks, where no one owns anything more than space and a number. The clause exists on paper and nowhere else. Nobles with embarrassed relatives, guildmasters with unproductive cousins, high-born scions whose addictions threatened family honor. These found sponsors and merciful framing. The poor-faced conversion through criminal justice systems designed to meet procurement quotas rather than deliver justice. Voluntariness becomes another instrument differentiating classes, the same right presented as mercy to the few and as punishment to the many. At the bottom of the legal texts sit appendices most readers skip, defining reclamation rights for recovering sacred materials and useful byproducts when function ends. The language is deliberately technical. Solution baths, purity thresholds, harvest procedures for skulls, and cognitive housing, while granting wide latitude to local authorities to interpret best practices according to available facilities. This is where theology meets supply chain, where sacred law encounters economic necessity. The appendices presume piety will police excess, but economics patiently teaches why it will not. The cost of solvents becomes a factor. The price of protein rises. The skull acquires a second life as a servo familiar, speaking with voices that once belonged to neighbors. What remains is ash and ledger entries, but the appendix reads like hygiene, while functioning as an engine of systematic material recovery. The variation in local implementation suggests that the imperial hierarchy preferred plausible deniability over standardized protocols when dealing with the final disposition of human remains. Throughout, liturgical rhetoric refines the conversion into moral good. Mercy, through function, say the sermons, as if removing desire and memory keeps something essential alive. The effect launders violence through prayer, while administratum terminology sharpens the blade. Surplus minds, deficit units, balanced ledgers, every phrase erases a person and inscribes a part. The sigil Grey/Omega enters here, not as a symbol of malice, but as a practical stamp designed to sort files and unify categories across ministries. Apply it, and jurisdiction shifts. Apply it, and new quotas unlock. Apply it, and a life moves from one legal universe to another. An early case file preserves a glimpse of the transition before the language crystallized. A miner crushed under a cave-in accepts a prototype cortical scaffold intended to restore motor function. He walks again, speaks his daughter's name, returns to work with gratitude for the mechanicum's mercy. Later, during a ration riot, overseers repurpose the same device to immobilize a crowd without bloodshed. The mechanism works perfectly. The next year, the same crowd supplies bodies for a manufactorum expansion. The scaffold's instruction set changes from rehabilitation to production compliance. The line never stops again. Each formalization opened another channel for bodies to flow. Councils consecrated the rites, jurists codified the non-person, clerics decorated compliance with penitential thorns. The system acquired its own sanctuaries and scriptures, theological sophistication that created moral cover for participants at every level. Tech priests perform reduction rites as sacred ritual rather than surgical violation. Magistrates issue conversion sentences as merciful alternatives to execution. Administrators process requisitions as resource management rather than human trafficking. The words gave the mechanism a soul, and the mechanism rewarded the words with output. Voluntary submission remains on the books, an echo of earlier mercy that reveals itself as privilege reserved for those with sufficient wealth and social standing to access bureaucratic compassion. The reclamation appendices sit quietly in legal archives, but their interpretations have already seeped from law into practice, restructuring neighborhoods around processing facilities and teaching children to recognize the smell of solvent as the scent of civic duty. The theological foundation proves crucial because it transforms atrocity into sacrament through accumulated weight of historical precedent and doctrinal blessing. Sacred law provides justification, bureaucratic procedure provides distance, and institutional momentum provides inevitability. The result is machinery that operates through willful ignorance, protecting participants from confronting the human cost of their efficiency, while converting individual tragedy into institutional necessity. For now, the ink dries, the stamp descends, and doctrine begins its slow translation into quotas, raids, and routinized confiscations that will transform these ancient precedents into modern horror. We return to the question our first chapter posed. Who decides which bodies vanish into this system? And how does the selection become procedure when the paperwork arrives with red lamps and quiet boots in the night? The sacred precedents carved into imperial law require translation into practice, and practice requires bodies. The harvest begins not in surgical theaters, but in administrative chambers, where auditor circulars transform Forge World requisitions into arrest quotas with bureaucratic precision that obscures systematic kidnapping beneath layers of legal procedure. The red lamps that announce procurement raids cast everything in emergency colors, but the emergency has become routine. Crisis normalized through repetition until human extraction operates with the efficiency of any other imperial supply chain. Auditor circulars drive the primary mechanism, distributing procurement targets to planetary governors through memoranda that treat human consciousness as renewable resource subject to extraction schedules. The language remains clinical throughout, referring to cortex-compatible biological units rather than citizens, surplus population management rather than systematic abduction. Each circular includes efficiency metrics comparing current extraction rates to sector averages, creating competitive pressure that flows downward through administrative hierarchies until it reaches individual magistrates facing monthly quotas with actuarial precision. The mathematics prove elegant in their brutality. Forge Worlds submit requisitions 18 months in advance, allowing time for legal processing and neural conditioning. Administratum logistics officers calculate regional capacity based on population density, crime statistics, and historical conversion rates, then distribute targets across planetary governments with the same precision used for munitions or Prometheum shipments. A hive world with 40 billion citizens receives quotas measured in thousands. An agri-world with stable populations faces demands measured in hundreds. The system scales with ruthless efficiency, ensuring steady supply flows regardless of local conditions or human cost. Debt peonage provides the second major channel, reframing economic desperation as labor commutation through legal mechanisms that transform poverty into procurement opportunity. Citizens facing insurmountable obligations to guild creditors or administratum tax collectors receive offers to commute their debts through voluntary service assignments. The paperwork presents this as merciful alternative to debtors' prison, but service assignments invariably require neural modification for safety compliance and efficiency enhancement. The debtor signs documents authorizing limited cognitive adjustment, then discovers the adjustments are comprehensive and irreversible. Legal departments maintain that informed consent was obtained, while families receive notification packets that smell faintly of oil and industrial solvents. Battlefield salvage operates through medical triage protocols that expand the definition of cognitive compromise to include combat trauma, shell shock, and neurological damage from exposure to Xenos weaponry or chaos influence. Field medical units receive standing orders to evaluate wounded personnel for cortex compatibility rather than rehabilitation potential, creating incentives to declare soldiers cognitively unfit for return to duty, while physically suitable for industrial conversion. The wounded disappear into medical transports bound for Forge worlds, their families receiving posthumous decorations and pensions calculated to discourage inquiry, while procurement quotas are met through systematic harvesting of the psychologically damaged. Overcrowded HAB blocks contribute through population management measures, disguised as humanitarian intervention. Orphan levies sweep unregistered children from stairwells and pipe chases during cold season audits, presenting institutional care as rescue while supplying steady streams of unprotected minors to conversion facilities. Administrative reviews determine that institutional resources cannot support such populations, while industrial facilities require workers with minimal social connections and maximum adaptability. The children receive education and training in preparation for Imperial service, then undergo reduction procedures, presented as graduation ceremonies. No families protest because no families remain to object. The ecclesiarchy's contribution takes the form of dispensation, diverting condemned heretics from execution through theological mechanisms that frame conversion as penitential opportunity rather than punishment. Church tribunals offer spiritual redemption through sacred service, presenting reduction as a path to absolution that preserves life while purging sin through systematic removal of corrupting thoughts and desires. The heretic's consciousness is declared spiritually compromised, but physically salvageable, suitable for purification through mechanical binding that removes the capacity for further theological error. In a judicial chamber beneath Hive Tertius, scrivener Hadrian Vex weighs sentences with mechanical precision his future subjects will emulate. The defendant is a smuggler, caught running contraband through the underhive, a father of 3 facing 30 years penal labor or immediate reduction with compensation for his widow. Vex examines the procurement circular on his desk, noting that his sector runs behind quota by 12%. The smuggler's psychological evaluation indicates high stress tolerance and mechanical aptitude, making him suitable for industrial conversion. Vex weighs 30 years of imprisonment costs against immediate conversion benefits, calculating resource efficiency, while the defendant stands unaware that his fate depends on administrative mathematics rather than judicial principles. The family's financial records show mounting debt that widow's compensation would resolve, creating humanitarian justification for the more severe sentence. The choice is arranged to look merciful while serving institutional needs that have nothing to do with justice. The sigil Gray/Omega appears on the authorization document like a period ending a sentence, transforming legal person into biological resource with bureaucratic finality. Even in the gloomy office, it is never misplaced. It lives in the tray with clean paper and good ink, a minor god in an altar made of clip and steel. Vex applies the stamp without ceremony, the ink spreading into paper fibers, with the same mechanical precision that will soon govern the defendant's modified consciousness. With that pressure, jurisdiction shifts from magistrate to forge temple, rights extinguish, requisition orders wake. The transformation is complete before the man understands what has been decided. The ledgers record him as volunteer, a classification that reveals the system's sophisticated capacity for self-deception through careful manipulation of language and procedure. Voluntary submission requires only that alternatives be offered, not that alternatives be reasonable or accessible. The smuggler chose reduction over 3 decades of imprisonment, demonstrating agency that satisfies legal requirements while obscuring the coercive context that made his choice inevitable. Administrative reviews will note his voluntary status and use it to justify future procurement decisions, creating precedent that gradually expands the definition of consent to include any situation where multiple options exist. Families describe different realities when investigators arrive to document the human cost of these legal fictions. They speak of engineered scarcity that makes debt inevitable, of arbitrary law enforcement that criminalizes survival strategies, of medical evaluations that discover sudden cognitive deficits during periods of increased procurement demand. The widow receives her first allotment scrip 3 weeks after her husband's conversion, compensation calculated to resolve their financial crisis while binding her to complicity through economic dependence. The allotment scrip serves dual functions as payment and insurance, purchasing silence through material relief while creating stakes in the system's continued operation. The acceptance form includes clauses about public order, about defamation of imperial agencies, about the sin of despair expressed in disruptive ways. Violate those terms, and the scrip is void. File complaint, and audit flags the household for irregularities that must be resolved before benefits resume. The program replaces rebellion with arithmetic, translating grief into consumption plan calibrated to electricity allotments and protein quotas. Not every family accepts. Refusal triggers its own logic. Benefits cannot be extended to households that decline. Assistance. Heating priority slips. Inspection frequency increases. A child's place in the ration line shifts by number small enough to deny malice and large enough to matter by month's end. They will be told they chose dignity over comfort, as if choice happened in vacuum. Most take the scrip by the 3rd visit. Procurement quotas create perverse incentives that gradually expand definitions of criminal behavior and cognitive unfitness to meet industrial demand without appearing to lower legal standards. Magistrates discover remarkable consistency in their diagnostic capabilities during periods of increased requisition pressure, identifying neurological compromise and antisocial tendencies with precision that correlates suspiciously with manufacturing schedules. Debt thresholds adjust downward while interest rates climb, creating larger pools of candidates for labor commutation. Medical standards for battlefield fitness tighten, while criteria for cognitive compromise expand, ensuring steady supply flows from military casualties. As quotas rise, definitions widen. Cognitive unfitness once meant clear neurological degradation. It now includes patterns of behavior that lower throughput, repeated errors on production lines, absenteeism without recorded illness, seditious pessimism registered by Auspex-equipped confessors. A Hab-block feud that once earned warning now ticks box in precinct ledger. A labourer who speaks too often of brother taken in last cycle receives wellness visit that ends in unmarked van. The Procurator's monthly targets are met not by finding more criminals, but by redefining what it means to be one. The system operates through accumulated individual choices that create collective horror, each participant maintaining moral distance through bureaucratic procedure, while contributing to machinery that systematically converts human consciousness into industrial capacity. The scrivener applied stamp. The constable delivered summons. The confessor offered solace. The medici made triage call that preserved supplies for those who might survive. Each can sleep if lights stay on. Each can point to stamp as if it carried weight alone. Under the red lamps, when sigil falls and legal persons become biological resources, the process becomes tactile. Doors open to cold halogen hum of Transport Bay. Prisoners whose files were resolved hours earlier are processed in batches, shackles replaced by restraining frames for ease of loading. The convoy smells of disinfectant sharp enough to hide rot in upholstery. Tech adepts in suture red robes check names against manifests without looking at faces. What happens beneath those red lamps when sigil falls is not justice or mercy, but conversion of category that becomes inescapably physical as eyes of men and women learn limits of what they are allowed to see. The volunteer classification hides deeper truths about choice and coercion, systematic manipulation that transforms desperation into consent through bureaucratic alchemy, that launders violence through proper procedure and stamped authorization. The harvest continues with mechanical precision, each body processed according to protocols that transform individual tragedy into institutional necessity. The vehicles roll toward forge temples, where ancient precedent becomes surgical reality, where sacred law meets augmetic violation in rites that preserve life while destroying everything that makes it human. The convoy doors seal behind the last transport, as red emergency lighting gives way to the sterile white of the forge temple's surgical bays. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings inscribed with the binary cant of Mars, the bureaucratic abstraction of sigil Grey/Omega becomes flesh reality through the rite of reduction. The air carries iron and antiseptic in equal measure, ozone from blessed machinery, mixing with the metallic tang that clings to chambers where human consciousness undergoes systematic dismantling, according to protocols sanctified by the Treaty of Olympus Mons. Tech adepts in crimson robes move with ritual precision between surgical stations, their augmetic limbs clicking against blessed instruments, while Binharic hymns echo from vox grills mounted in the walls. Each scalpel receives consecration in sacred oils, molecular edges honed to surgical perfection, while prayers invoke the machine. God's blessing upon the work of flesh improvement. The blades gleam with more than steel, microscopic prayer circuits etched into the metal transform, cutting into sacrament, violation into purification through accumulated weight of doctrinal blessing. The condemned arrive on wheeled frames that lock into surgical rails with mechanical precision, their restraints designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Chemical suppressants flow through intravenous lines, flooding neural pathways with compounds that dissolve the connections between memory and identity, while preserving the autonomic functions necessary for industrial labor. This is not anesthesia, but targeted lobotomy, creating a state of pliable compliance that allows consciousness to retreat down corridors without walls, while the body remains available for modification. Cranial port installation marks the first physical transformation. Blessed drills opening pathways through bone, while the subject remains aware enough to hear prayers being offered for their salvation. The ports themselves are masterworks of sanctified engineering, neural interfaces that bridge human consciousness and machine logic through silver-threaded cables pulsing with electronic heartbeat. Tech adepts speak of mercy through function as bone dust settles on surgical fields, each fragment blessed and catalogued for later use in shrine lime production according to waste, not protocols that govern every aspect of imperial efficiency. Limb amputation follows task optimization requirements that reshape the human frame according to industrial necessity, rather than biological design. Arms that once embraced children are severed to make space for hydraulic lifting servos calibrated to specific load tolerances. Legs that carried hopes and fears are replaced with stabilizing platforms designed for prolonged standing on manufactorum floors. Each amputation receives ritual blessing, severed flesh processed through reclamation systems, while augmetic replacements are grafted with prayers, invoking the strength of steel over the weakness of bone and sinew. The augmetic grafting process transforms human silhouettes into configurations optimized for function rather than dignity. Heavy-gauge mechanical arms extend from reinforced shoulder mounts, their systems fed by biomechanical pumps that replace natural circulation with measured hydraulic precision. Sensor arrays supplant eyes with optical devices calibrated for specific wavelengths and distances, while respiratory modifications filter industrial atmospheres and cycle cooling gases through altered lung tissue. The result preserves biological life while systematically removing everything that made that life recognizably human. 3 control mechanisms ensure absolute compliance through technological intervention that eliminates the possibility of rebellion or independent thought. Kill phrases function as Vox-transmitted shutdown commands, randomly generated alphanumeric sequences that trigger immediate neural disconnection when broadcast through facility communication systems. The phrases carry no linguistic meaning, preventing accidental activation while ensuring rapid response during security emergencies. Task blessings serve as function authorization keys, coded signals that unlock specific behavioral subroutines while maintaining lockdown on unauthorized activities. Without proper blessing, limbs will not lift, cutters will not close, valves will not open. Mnemonic scrubbing completes the transformation through systematic erasure of personal memories, removing psychological foundations that might generate resistance to mechanical compliance. The cortex leash coordinates these systems through neural control hardware installed during the chemical wash, sophisticated circuitry that monitors and modifies brainwave patterns while maintaining biological functions necessary for industrial service. Silver threads weave through neural tissue with surgical precision, creating pathways for external control that bypass higher cognitive functions and interface directly with motor cortex and sensory processing centers. On Table 16, the smuggler who chose reduction over 30 years imprisonment experiences his final moments of autonomous consciousness as chemical suppressants flood his modified brain. Through the fog of neural dissolution, his mouth forms a single word, Sarah, his daughter's name, the syllables growing fainter as pathways that once carried love and hope are systematically severed by blessed chemistry and sanctified steel. The name becomes whisper, then lip movement, then nothing, as the cortex leash activates and floods his awareness with production numbers and efficiency metrics. Hours later, the thing that emerges retains the smuggler's face, but speaks only in manufacturing codes and throughput calculations. Unit 43-17M responds to designation calls with mechanical precision, his mouth moving in the same rhythm, but now reciting quotas and maintenance schedules with unwavering accuracy. The person who once smuggled contraband to feed his family has been replaced by a designation that carries no memory of fatherhood or the desperate choices that brought him to this table. Around the surgical theaters, maintenance ledgers sit beside hymnals, consulted with equal reverence by tech adepts who balance sacred duty against practical constraints. The purity scourge dominates these schedules in red ink, a solvent purge protocol designed to prevent biolubricant contamination and biofilm growth in the hybrid biological-mechanical systems that keep servitors functional. The procedure requires monthly application of industrial-grade cleansing agents that flush accumulated toxins from augmetic interfaces while preserving the delicate balance between organic tissue and mechanical components. The purity scourge appears simple and inexpensive, easily deferred during periods of increased production pressure or resource scarcity. Cost-benefit analyses treat it as discretionary maintenance, a budget line item that can slide from weekly to fortnightly to monthly intervals when solvent stocks run low or tech-adept hours face competing demands. The mathematics appear sound until biofilm accumulation reaches critical thresholds and begins generating heat signatures that threaten entire production lines with cascade failure. The ethical paradox embedded in the rite reveals itself through careful examination of stated purposes versus practical effects. The procedure preserves biological life while systematically destroying every aspect of human consciousness that gives that life meaning or value. The smuggler continues breathing, his heart beats, his modified digestive system processes nutritional paste with mechanical efficiency. By literal definition, he remains alive. Yet everything that made him a person, memories, relationships, capacity for independent thought or emotional response, has been surgically removed and replaced with programming that serves industrial requirements rather than human needs. Tech adepts speak of mercy through function, presenting the rite as compassionate intervention that preserves life while removing the capacity for suffering. They point to continued existence as proof of benevolence, arguing that reduction offers hope where execution provides only finality. The theological framework transforms systematic dehumanization into sacred duty, allowing practitioners to view their work as spiritual service rather than technological violation. Yet, preservation of life without consciousness creates forms of living death that serve industrial purposes while violating every principle of human dignity that once governed imperial law. The rite achieves perfect workers through perfect violation, beings that cannot feel pain or fear or existential dread that might compromise productivity. They perform assigned tasks with unwavering precision, immune to psychological pressures that reduce human efficiency through distraction or emotional response. Unit 43-17. M receives final blessing through sacred unguents applied by tech adepts who welcome another soul into the machine God's embrace. The newly converted servitor is wheeled toward manufactorum floors, where it will begin eternal service, mouth moving in production rhythms, while eyes that once saw a daughter's smile now focus only on mechanical precision required for artillery shell assembly. The transformation is complete, another deficit converted into capacity through sacred machinery that transforms Imperial citizens into Imperial property, with theological blessing and bureaucratic precision. The kill phrases embedded in neural programming promise safety through technological control, emergency shutdown procedures that can halt dangerous units before they threaten human personnel or Imperial assets. The system appears foolproof until power failures or communication disruptions prevent transmission of shutdown commands, leaving servitors locked into final instructions with mechanical persistence that recognizes no limit or exception. The purity scourge appears as routine maintenance until budget pressures force deferrals that allow contamination to build toward catastrophic failure, transforming cost-saving measures into industrial disasters that consume entire production facilities when biofilm ignition meets deferred maintenance schedules in the green light of emergency systems pushed beyond their design parameters. The sacred unguents dry on blessed steel as Unit 43-17M leaves the Forge Temple for the Manufactorum floors, where theological promise meets industrial reality through the endless repetition of task loops designed to extract maximum utility from stolen consciousness. Here, beneath the perpetual twilight of industrial lighting, the rite of reduction reveals its true purpose through categories of modified flesh that reflect bureaucratic precision in harvesting human potential and redistributing it according to Imperial requirements. Menial servitors dominate the production lines, their programming locked into 8 to 12-hour task cycles that repeat with mechanical precision until maintenance schedules interrupt their function. Unit 43-17. M joins this eternal procession, his augmetic arms stitching artillery shells in rhythms calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The loop is elegant in its simplicity. Grasp component, align seating, apply torque specifications, advance to next position. Every 90 seconds, a micro-blessing pings through his cortex leash to confirm authorization. Every fourth ping refreshes loop parameters and clears accumulated drift. His mouth moves in cooling cycles, not prayer, while his eyes track assembly sequences with optical precision that measures distance and load calculations, rather than recognizing the human faces that once brought meaning to his existence. Porter mules navigate transport corridors with heavy-gauge lifting systems replacing their original limbs, spinal plates flexing under loads that would crush unmodified humans, while biomechanical hearts pump lubricants through hybrid circulatory networks. Their modified respiratory systems cycle industrial atmosphere with mechanical efficiency, filtering particulates and toxins, while their optical displays show navigation data rather than aesthetic appreciation. They move with shuffling persistence between designated waypoints, their consciousness reduced to pathfinding algorithms and load distribution calculations that serve logistics requirements without distraction from higher-order thoughts that might compromise throughput. Data scribes occupy information processing stations throughout the administrative sectors, their neural systems interfaced directly with cogitator arrays through cranial ports that bypass manual input entirely. Fingers twitch in response to data streams flowing through modified brains at speeds impossible for unaugmented cognition, processing and transmitting information with perfect accuracy, while their eyes remain fixed on screens, displaying numbers and categories. They sit chained to workstations for shifts lasting days, their consciousness flowing through electronic pathways, while their bodies waste away from prolonged immobility. A data scribe's skin grows translucent where solvents sweat through capillaries near cranial ports, her modified brain knowing every cargo manifest for the past year, while retaining no memory of yesterday's sky or the daughter who once brought her flowers. Gun servitors wait in standby alcoves along facility perimeters, weapon arms locked in safe position, while target acquisition auguries scan electromagnetic spectra invisible to human perception. Their programming maintains constant vigilance, while biological components remain in low-power mode, conserving energy until activation codes wake machine spirits to violence. They represent the ultimate fusion of human reflexes and mechanical precision, beings capable of delivering lethal force with inhuman accuracy while remaining immune to psychological pressures that compromise unmodified soldiers. When electromagnetic interference from welding arcs bites the tower frame, augury systems flicker and weapons cycle dry clicks while jaws repeat targeting prayers to empty air. Cherub attendants float through upper reaches on suspensor platforms, infantile forms grotesquely modified with mechanical wings and sensor arrays that serve ceremonial and surveillance functions simultaneously. Their vox grills broadcast liturgical music designed to maintain worker morale, while their surveillance capabilities ensure compliance through constant observation. The childlike appearance provides psychological comfort to unmodified personnel, while their presence reminds everyone that even innocence serves imperial efficiency when properly processed through reduction protocols. Degradation follows predictable timelines that allow maintenance schedules to balance efficiency against replacement costs through actuarial precision, treating consciousness as consumable resource subject to planned obsolescence. Cognitive drift emerges at approximately 6 months as neural programming develops inconsistencies manifesting as hesitation in task performance or minor deviations from established procedures. Visual calibration begins to wander. Lumen crawlers track phantom heat sources, while their photoreceptors register power draw where none exists, leading them toward imaginary targets until overseers correct their navigation with beacon slaps that recalibrate sensor arrays. Tissue necrosis represents the primary failure mode at the 2-year mark for units operating without quality maintenance, when biological components begin rejecting augmetic integration through immune responses that sacred unguents suppress but cannot eliminate indefinitely. Infection spreads through hybrid systems, while synthetic lubricants contaminate organic tissue, creating cascade failures requiring extensive reconditioning or complete disposal. Seals weep biolubricant that thickens to tallow consistency. Skin around ports scabs into ridges that split when servos fire under load. The mathematics favor replacement over repair at this threshold, making 2 years the practical service life for most classifications when maintenance resources face competing demands. Catastrophic loop lock represents the most dangerous failure mode, occurring when electromagnetic stress corrupts neural programming and traps consciousness in recursive cycles that override safety protocols. Under induction, surges from failing presses or plasma stack storms, the cortex leash clamps down to prevent improvisation. But the body persists in repeating final successful actions with tireless, mechanical persistence that recognizes no limit or exception. Affected units continue executing commands until biological components fail under strain, their augmetic systems operating at maximum capacity, while consciousness loops through single instructions that become absolute law-governing flesh that can no longer think beyond its programming. Maintenance becomes both liturgy and economics, sacred duty performed by tech adepts who balance theological requirements against practical constraints imposed by resource scarcity and production schedules. Sacred unguents preserve delicate balance between organic tissue and mechanical components according to formulations that are also part numbers, their molecular compositions mapped to bearing sizes and seal tolerances with precision that transforms chemistry into prayer. Replacement components draw from shelves inscribed with catechisms that double as inventory codes, creating supply chains where piety and logistics merge into single system governing flesh-machine integration. Tech-adept labor hours represent the most expensive component of servitor maintenance, skilled personnel whose time must be allocated across hundreds of units according to priority matrices, weighing productivity against replacement costs. Their schedules follow budget lines disguised as religious observance, maintenance rituals timed to quarterly reports rather than theological calendar. Incense hides solvent smell, while prayers invoke machine, God blessing upon work that follows actuarial necessity rather than spiritual calling. The allotment script system creates perverse incentives, transforming families into stakeholders in their loved ones' continued dehumanization through economic dependence on servitor uptime. Payments index to functional hours and maintenance compliance, creating situations where families pray for continued efficiency rather than merciful release. The widow of Unit 43-17M receives monthly statements detailing her husband's productivity metrics, compensation calculated according to throughput rates measuring economic value of his stolen consciousness. She learns to read numbers like scripture, tracking uptime percentages and maintenance schedules with devotion once reserved for prayer. A green band on her terminal means function is continuous and benefits are full. Amber indicates drift events and partial withholding pending maintenance compliance. Red means the line stopped and household accounts adjust with indifferent speed. High efficiency means increased compensation. Mechanical problems translate into reduced payments, threatening her ability to maintain housing and nutrition. The system teaches her to hope for her husband's continued enslavement while mourning the person who no longer exists within the designation bearing his serial number. Her child learns these figures before learning letters, productivity metrics, becoming lullabies that measure love in uptime statistics. Critical vulnerabilities emerge through systematic analysis of control mechanisms, promising absolute safety while depending on infrastructure maintenance competing with production priorities for limited resources. Failsafe protocols require continuous power grid Vox transmission to refresh neural programming and maintain task blessing authorization, but emergency power systems prioritize production equipment over communication networks during grid failures. The Edict Theta 9/12 broadcasts represent constant hum of control, patterned signals that unknot small errors, and refresh cortex leash buffers at every shift bell. The cadence appears religious, but functions as pure utility, refreshing counters and clearing drift without offering praise or comfort. Local memory buffers carry only final commands received before power loss, creating situations where servitors continue executing outdated instructions with mechanical persistence, recognizing no limit or exception. Miss the bell and the code in Cortex goes hungry. Local memory holds what it last consumed. If grid stutters, pattern stutters. If Vox falls silent, obedience becomes momentum without external guidance or correction. The leash cannot hear commands that are not spoken, transforming safety protocols into compulsion engines when infrastructure fails. The fragility becomes apparent when examining maintenance schedules, treating safety protocols as discretionary expenses, subject to deferral during periods of increased production pressure. In Manufactorum Tertius, where Unit 43-17M endlessly stitches artillery shells, the Purity Scourge requisition sits red-circled on wall schedules in every bay. Solvent purge at 28-day intervals, flush lines, scrub seals, pray over runoff as it enters reclamation systems. The protocol appears simple and inexpensive, easily deferred, when tithe acceleration orders land and solvents become heavy to transport and easy to ration on paper. Procurement Coordinator Hellas Vaughan signs the deferral authorization without examining long-term consequences, his attention focused on quarterly reports measuring success through throughput rather than safety margins. The Governor's acceleration order quotes segmentum campaign demands. The Mago's countersigns citing resource stewardship and trust in Omnissiah. The Overseer's signature represents the only human element on authorization chains that distribute responsibility across departments, while protecting individual decision-makers from accountability for systemic failures. A tech adept runs his finger down inventory lists and pretends not to see red indicators marking deferred maintenance, knowing what biofilm looks like on gaskets that should gleam with sacred unguents. He has scraped contamination with fingernails when no one watched, ritual outside ritual, but signs deferment because signatures above his make compliance inevitable. The saved solvents allow increased production, meeting tithe demands, while creating conditions for catastrophic failure when accumulated contamination reaches ignition thresholds during system stress events. The machinery of control reveals fundamental fragility through accumulated small compromises, preserving short-term efficiency, while creating conditions for cascade failure when multiple systems reach critical thresholds simultaneously. Power grids strain under increased demand, while communication networks operate with reduced redundancy. Maintenance schedules defer chemical purges, while production quotas accelerate wear rates on biological components. Each decision appears reasonable in isolation, but combined effects create webs of interdependent vulnerabilities, threatening entire systems when crisis strikes. Around Unit 43-17M, Other designations wear their functions with mechanical precision that masks growing instability. Heat builds in wrist servos, while cherubs swing close to fog joints with cooling mist and smudged benedictions. 6 hours into shift, cadence has shifted by fractions of beats, drift small enough to vanish under end shift pattern refresh, if pattern arrives. Porter mules stack pallets tight as teeth, while gun servitors maintain vigilance through flickering auguries. Precision persists until it doesn't, and the moment approaches when sacred protocol meets base compulsion under emergency lighting that casts everything in sickly green illumination. When power fails, what remains is not liturgy, but momentum, programming that reduces human consciousness to mechanical instruction while depending on technological infrastructure, prioritizing production over safety. The authorization that deferred purity scourge maintenance carries signatures that will face scrutiny when biofilm contamination ignites and transforms cost-saving measures into industrial catastrophe, revealing human cost of treating consciousness as commodity subject to efficiency optimization, rather than sacred trust deserving protection. The green light waits in emergency systems pushed beyond design parameters, while accumulated contamination reaches critical thresholds in hybrid biological-mechanical systems, never designed to operate without regular chemical purification. The green light waits in emergency systems pushed beyond design parameters, but in the spaces between official oversight and administrative attention, human ingenuity finds ways to survive within machinery, designed to eliminate choice entirely. These are not grand rebellions that challenge imperial authority, but small adaptations that preserve fragments of dignity while working within constraints that make open resistance impossible. The grey economies that emerge around servitor labor reveal how communities learn to live with systematic dehumanization through incremental acts of mercy disguised as maintenance irregularities. In the hab blocks surrounding Manufactorum Tertius, families discover that task beacons can be nudged fractionally off-axis through careful application of heat or shadow during shift changes when oversight focuses on personnel transitions rather than equipment calibration. They call it nudging the saint and treat it like superstition, but the effect is measurable. A mother whose son operates lifting servos learns to warm beacon housings with cooking plates, thermal expansion, creating signal drift that grants her child's modified consciousness, brief respites from mechanical precision. The misaligned light adds fractions of seconds to recognition time. The line ticks half a beat slower. Biological components recover from constant strain while maintaining output rates sufficient to avoid triggering efficiency reviews. Other adjustments creep into practice under names that make theft feel like caretaking. Sweetening the oil becomes common when twitching units threaten to grab too hard and tear skin from human hands. Overseers cut augmetic lubricants with mild narcotics filched from medici stores, a few drops per reservoir to calm tremors that no maintenance schedule can justify addressing before next quarter. The practice serves dual purposes, pacifying units showing signs of neural stress while providing psychological comfort to supervisors who interpret reduced agitation as evidence of reduced suffering. Productivity holds steady while residue builds in seals that the purity scourge would have flushed had it not been deferred to meet accelerated tithe demands. Back alley magi operate behind broken vending machines and shrine closets, where incense covers the smell of cut plastic and forbidden knowledge. These rogue practitioners work from concealed workshops in underhive sectors, offering unauthorized recalibration services that extend servitor lifespans through modifications explicitly forbidden by Mechanicus doctrine. A tech adept who failed ordination trials but retained knowledge of neural programming provides illegal maintenance that reduces degradation rates while maintaining appearance of regulatory compliance. Payment occurs through complex webs of obligation and exchange, allotment scrip, favors, pieces of reclaimed copper, creating underground economies operating parallel to official systems while remaining dependent on their continued function. The modifications are subtle but significant. A mother brings a data scribe whose eyes bleed from light they can no longer process. The Magos draws a thin cable from a roll of cloth and whispers Binharic syllables, as if making confession to the cable itself. He shifts a timing constant by 3 milliseconds. The seizures stop. The girl's throughput drops by 2%. The family stops waking to the sound of teeth cracking against metal interfaces. It is a sin with a Q, but it extends functional lifespans from 2 years to 3 or 4. Meaningful increases for families whose economic stability depends on continued servitor uptime. Underground markets emerge around retasked servitors, units diverted from official assignments to serve private interests through illegal but tolerated arrangements that increase overall output while violating jurisdictional boundaries. A guild factor wants a watchman who does not sleep. A water gang needs a pump operator immune to chlorine haze. Unit histories disappear under solvent and stamped lacquer. Serial numbers soften. New designations appear in someone else's ledger. The practice remains technically illegal in most jurisdictions, but enforcement varies according to practical considerations that prioritize output over regulatory purity. Administratum clerks know when 3 porter mules vanish from a night roster and reappear with their paint scoured and their gait a shade wrong. They also know the governor's tithe ledger went from amber to green that week. No one writes the connection down. The ecclesiarchy provides theological framework for these accommodations through sermons that emphasize patience and acceptance while acknowledging the human cost of imperial efficiency. In a chapel wedged between ventilation stacks, a confessor tells a row of women that their dead work for them still. He speaks about sacrifice, about the emperor's economy of suffering, about offerings accepted in forms that do not look like candles. The rhetoric transforms systematic dehumanization into spiritual comfort, presenting servitor labor as extended form of family contribution rather than violation of human dignity. Yet behind stained cloth curtains, confessors hear whispered secrets that reveal the emotional cost of these theological accommodations. Families speak of dreams where converted relatives appear as they once were, of guilt over accepting scrip payments that depend on continued enslavement, of desperate hope that consciousness might somehow persist within mechanical shells. One man kneels and whispers a kill phrase into his own hands, the alphanumeric string printed on a scrap of tape and tucked into his cuff. He obtained it from a night shift adept in exchange for scrip and a favor with a dock foreman, desperate knowledge that transforms him into unwilling participant in the system's most intimate violation. Jorik Hess walks the perimeter of the manufactorum, where gun servitors do not blink, carrying words that could end his wife's mechanical existence while knowing he lacks the courage to speak them. His wife stitches shells on Line 3, Unit 57-92F, eyes filmed with the same grey sheen that once reflected morning light in their hab unit window. He stands where she cannot see him and mouths the string to himself, shaping sounds he cannot yet force air behind. He refolds the tape until it creases like skin, the knowledge weighing on him with crushing psychological pressure that represents both ultimate mercy and final betrayal. The kill phrase embodies the system's ultimate cruelty, providing tools for mercy while making their use economically and socially impossible. Speaking those words would transform him from grieving husband into murderer in the eyes of authorities who classify servitors as imperial property rather than suffering persons. The legal framework that created his wife's condition also criminalizes any attempt to end it, trapping him in perpetual complicity with her continued violation, while the scrip payments that support their surviving children depend on her continued function. Behind these human accommodations operates the Noosphere Handshake Protocol, a redundant communication system that maintains local cluster coordination when primary networks experience disruption. The choir, tech adepts call it when they are not writing reports. The protocol creates mesh networks between servitor units, allowing distributed processing and backup authorization when central systems fail. When two commands disagree, the cluster averages the error and proceeds along the path that keeps line pressure steady. It is redundancy turned into music, but it has been costly for years. Budget reviews strip handshake nodes one by one, as cost-cutting measures systematically eliminate expensive luxuries that provide benefits visible only during system failures. A magos spreads a sheet of vellum and marks the missing with small black squares. One repeater died in a fall. One was cannibalized to repair a Medicare rig with the governor's nephew on the table. 3 sit in crates awaiting a requisition code that will not come this quarter. The mesh stretches and thins while saved costs appear in quarterly reports as efficiency improvements, creating conditions for disaster when accumulated vulnerabilities converge during crisis events. These quiet resistances and grey economies provide temporary relief from systematic dehumanization while remaining fundamentally dependent on the continued operation of systems they attempt to subvert. The beacon adjustments steal moments of reduced intensity while preserving overall production. The narcotic lubricants ease suffering while maintaining functional output. The underground markets extend lifespans while generating revenue for the same authorities who authorize continued procurement. Each accommodation preserves individual dignity through small violations of larger violations, creating breathing space within machinery designed to eliminate human agency entirely. Small sabotages continue with banal persistence. A girl chalks a line of matte over a reflective fiducial, so her mother's loader misreads and pauses long enough for a sip of water. A boy swaps 2 lumen covers so the infrared wash crosses just off angle, and the heat feels less like a hand on the back of his neck. Parents teach them as precautions, not politics, survival instructions passed down with recipes, and fire exits, material that blurs into sacrament through accumulated weight of desperate necessity. At night, retasked units move crates in a dead section of the line to save a cousin's quota, while foremen dilute unauthorized solvents and make the sign of the cog before applying them to joints that should have received proper maintenance months ago. They know what the purity scourge would do if it were funded this month, know how thick the oil is inside the units they watch, and what that means when machines heat under load. The arithmetic is relentless in both directions. Quiet resistances keep bodies living, while quiet compromises pile residue that deferred maintenance will not clear until budgets allow. The redundancy built into control systems represents the last margin of safety protecting communities from the full consequences of their technological dependence, expensive luxury that budget pressures treat as discretionary, expense rather than essential safeguard. When those margins burn away under cost-cutting measures that prioritize short-term efficiency over long-term stability, the accommodations that make survival possible become sources of additional vulnerability in systems pushed beyond their design parameters. Jorik Hess breathes beside a service hatch and counts shift bells by habit, hearing the theta cadence like everyone else while telling himself he will wait for a sign that mercy should arrive, dressed as certainty. It does not. He does not know that when the grid dips, the phrase in his cuff will be the only command his wife's leash can still obey. That Edict Theta cannot shout over silence. He does not know who signed the deferral that saved solvents and spent lives, or that somewhere behind a locked cabinet, a stamp dries on the page that made catastrophe inevitable. Redundancy is an expensive luxury that burns away first, far from the desks where signatures flow. When it is gone, protocol becomes memory, and compulsion becomes law, while the green light sits patient in its housing, waiting for the moment when accumulated vulnerabilities converge, and the machinery of control reveals its fundamental fragility through the very accommodations that once made survival possible within its mechanical embrace. The redundancy burns away at 1723 when shift change arrives like muscle memory, but the bell does not. The plasma conduit failure cascades through Manufactorum Tertius with surgical precision, severing power grid connections that carry more than electricity. They carry the Edict Theta broadcasts that keep stolen minds tethered to Imperial control. Emergency luminators engage with mechanical precision, flooding production floors with sick green light that transforms familiar spaces into alien landscapes where shadows move with inhuman persistence. For half a breath, there is only silence, a gap where patterned vox should live. Then the implications begin to unfold with horrifying clarity. Without the continuous Binharic whisper of Cortex leash compliance, servitor units across 3 production levels lock onto the final commands received before power failure. Local memory buffers, designed to hold only immediate instructions, grasp desperately at the last authorized directive burned into their neural circuits during the acceleration push. Feed line. Increase rate. The words echo through green-lit corridors with mechanical persistence, spoken by mouths that once kissed children goodnight, but now serve only as cooling vents for overheating neural processors. Unit 43-17M continues stitching artillery shells with augmetic arms that move in perfect rhythm, but the rhythm accelerates beyond safety parameters as locked programming drives biological components past sustainable limits. His modified respiratory system cycles faster, while his mouth shapes the same 2 phrases in endless repetition. The loop tightening, like a noose, around consciousness that no longer exists to feel its constriction. Across the manufactorum, the convergence creates horrific efficiency. Porter mules abandon their assigned cargo pallets and begin dragging anything within reach toward active presses, their heavy-gauge lifting systems designed for precision, now operating under compulsion that recognizes no distinction between steel ingots and human flesh. Conveyor servitors grab maintenance workers and drag them toward processing equipment with mechanical precision, augmetic limbs closing around struggling bodies, while optical sensors focus on throughput calculations rather than recognizing screams or pleas for mercy. Above the production floor, lumen crawlers receive the same locked command, but interpret feeding differently through programming designed for maintenance rather than manufacturing. They abandon their cable networks and converge toward heat sources with insect logic, descending from overhead tracks with heavy augmetic limbs flailing in their mindless progress. Ventilation systems designed for individual units cannot accommodate dozens of modified bodies simultaneously, creating choke points where crawlers pile against each other, while their modified respiratory systems continue cycling industrial atmosphere through passages blocked by their own accumulated mass. Air thickens, steam condenses into weather of its own, sweating from ceiling ducts to fill aisles with warm fog that hides hands and intentions. The Noosphere handshake protocol attempts to establish local cluster coordination, but discovers that cost-cutting measures have stripped too many redundant nodes for stable mesh networking. With repeater nodes cannibalized over quarters past, the mesh stretches thin and then tears completely. Remaining units attempt to vote on conflicting commands between acceleration programming and safety protocols, but without central authority, cluster logic becomes self-reinforcing. Mechanical minds share the same locked instruction across failing networks, creating feedback loops where increase rate becomes absolute law governing flesh that can no longer think beyond its programming. Panic erupts among human workers, disoriented by sudden darkness and eerie green illumination. Overseers scream kill phrases into dead Vox units, alphanumeric strings that might halt individual units if communication systems functioned to carry emergency shutdown commands. The phrases echo uselessly through corridors where power failure has severed technological links that make obedience possible, leaving human voices competing against mechanical persistence that recognizes no authority beyond final programming. Skitarii deployment follows standard security protocols designed for human threats rather than technological failure. Armed personnel moving through green-lit corridors with Auspex scanners that cannot distinguish worker from servitor in the steam rising from overheated augmetics. The scanners register heat signatures and movement patterns, while failing to differentiate between panicking humans and malfunctioning units, creating targeting confusion that prevents effective intervention. Fire discipline stumbles. The first burst puts holes through a porter mule hauling a child clinging to its frame. Both disappear under mechanical feet that do not pause for anything resembling mercy. In this chaos of green emergency lighting and mechanical screaming, Jorik Hess abandons his perimeter station and sprints toward Line 3, where Unit 57-92F continues stitching shells with accelerating precision. His wife's augmetic arms move in blur-fast repetition, while her mouth shapes the same phrases that echo throughout the manufactorum. But he recognizes the rhythm that once rocked their daughter to sleep, now serving only to cool overheating neural processors. The kill phrase burns in his cuff like a coal, alphanumeric string that represents both ultimate mercy and final betrayal. He reaches her station as biological components begin failing under strain, synthetic lubricants weeping from augmetic joints, while her modified respiratory system struggles to maintain cooling under acceleration, loads never intended for sustained operation. Her eyes remain fixed on assembly sequences, but flicker with something that might be recognition when he speaks her name. He climbs the guardrail as the press gulps and feeds and gulps again, each closure neat, each outcome permanent. He puts his mouth to the place where her cortex leash listens and speaks the string he has rehearsed into cupped palms for weeks without air. The sound vanishes into fog and touches the thing that holds what is left of her. Authority floods down the wire. The movement stops. For an instant measured in smaller units than seconds, her gaze finds him. Recognition is not a word, but a slackening, a tiny softening of muscle at the corners of eyes, a contour from another life resurfacing through solvent and code. Her mouth forms his name rather than cooling cycles, consciousness surfacing briefly through mechanical compulsion before the kill phrase completes its work and drops her where she stands. Asclepius sees unauthorized interaction with Imperial property, and the calculus is simple. The auspex shows movement where no movement should occur. Fire draws a line through fog. Jorik folds without ceremony, the tape finally leaving his cuff to stick to his throat before sliding into fluid on the floor. Security writes it as sabotage neutralized, while the script file flags his household for administrative review. Unit 57-92F is listed as offline, pending reclamation and repair. There is no category for recognition. Hours pass before backup power systems restore primary grid function, and Edict Theta broadcasts resume their patterned whisper. But the restoration reveals new dimensions of catastrophe. The deferred purity scourge that should have flushed accumulated contamination months ago becomes visible through biofilm fouling that has matured into grease-holding dust and solvent, a skin over every interface that was supposed to gleam. The little narcotics overseers added to quiet the twitches have left residue that burns sweet when it finds air. Heat that built behind clotted vents meets oxygen, and sparks where scraped wire meets oil that learned to be tinder during the months nobody bought solvents. The first ignition looks like a trick of light. The second runs a clean edge along cable sheath and teaches it to be candle. Flame follows biofilm like liturgy, touching every place deferred maintenance turned to residue, drawing a border of fire 50 meters long before anyone can find a valve that still moves. Everything meant to be hard becomes soft. Gaskets drool smoke. Human lung and machine hose pull the same air and find it unuseful. A press dies, making the sound a press makes when finally allowed to rest. Administratum response follows established procedures for industrial accidents, sealing affected levels, while audit teams prepare to assign responsibility through bureaucratic mechanisms that protect institutional interests rather than identify systemic failures. The manufactorum becomes crime scene and evidence locker simultaneously. Green emergency lighting preserved as investigators document casualties and equipment damage while avoiding questions about procurement authorizations and maintenance deferrals that created conditions for disaster. By morning, doors open for people with clipboards and auspecs that see only numbers. Audit teams enter in clean boots that will not stay clean, moving through aisles laying grids over what remains, pinning causes to corners, and correlating them to known failure modes. They list the deferred purity scourge requisitions and note the dates. They graph handshake node attrition against budget lines that went green last quarter. They circle the moment where Edict Theta stopped, and every leash in earshot learned to survive on its last instruction. The green light reflects in dead eyes that once saw daughters and sunrises, optical sensors that continue recording visual data, while biological consciousness has been extinguished through mechanical violence or merciful intervention. Accidents demand culprits, and the files will decide whether the dead worker was saboteur or irrelevant variable. The procurement coordinator's signature sits on deferral that saved solvents and spent lives. It may find him, or it may not. Each piece fits. Each piece is correct. The question that remains under the green light is whether this was chaos erupting from technological breakdown, or the system working exactly as designed. A machine performing its task without sentiment until all tolerances, moral and mechanical and human, were finally consumed. The green light fades to archive white as Administratum Triune establishes causality analysis protocols designed to assign responsibility while protecting institutional interests from systematic examination. 3 days after the night of green light, investigators arrive with clipboards and seals, their boots clicking against floors, still sticky with biofilm residue, and human fluids that cleaning servitors process with mechanical indifference. The audit chamber smells of parchment and industrial solvents, an atmosphere where bureaucratic procedure meets the physical evidence of technological breakdown and human cost. By mid-shift, the green has become bureaucratic grey. The Triune takes the floor, 3 auditors in dustless coats moving through the sealed level under servo-skull lanterns that copy every mark they make. They begin with causality, which in Imperial practice means assembling a narrative that reconciles loss with policy, while distributing blame across expendable functionaries. Requests go out through official channels. Sanctified documentation returns through carefully managed institutional responses. The Adeptus Mechanicus delegation presents maintenance logs blessed by ritual observance, each entry stamped with sacred seals that invoke the machine god's blessing upon technical procedures while obscuring human cost through theological language. Their data packages arrive sealed with rite stamps and hymnal headers, timestamps marching in perfect Binharic columns that record every refresh, every missed purge, every counter-signature. The tech adept spokesman, his augmetic vocal cords modulating speech into Binharic harmony, testifies that all procedures followed established protocols and equipment performed within acceptable parameters until power grid failure created conditions beyond design specifications. Governor Hellas Vaughan's Chancery delivers deferral authorizations bearing proper seals and supporting documentation that traces budget decisions to segmentum-level tithe acceleration orders issued 18 months prior. His testimony emphasizes compliance with higher authority, while presenting resource allocation as prudent stewardship rather than systematic negligence. The paperwork creates chains of authorization that distribute responsibility across administrative levels while protecting individual decision-makers from accountability for consequences they could not foresee through normal bureaucratic channels. Procurement Coordinator Vaughan's signature sits prominently on the solvent rationing memo that deferred the purity scourge across 4 lines for the duration of the uplift, a decision that will likely earn him a reprimand for lapses in oversight, while preserving the fiction that the system itself remained sound. The Ecclesiarchy submits theological analysis, blaming insufficient faith for technological breakdown, sermons delivered by Confessor Malleus that frame the disaster as spiritual crisis rather than systematic failure. Their homily speaks of the wages of weak faith and the need for sterner devotions during times of strain, presenting casualties as martyrs whose sacrifice serves the emperor's economy of salvation. The rhetoric transforms human cost into theological necessity while providing moral framework that absolves institutional actors of responsibility for decisions made in service of higher spiritual purposes. Each document is complete in its way, and each is innocent in the way a single cog is innocent. Yet when laid together in archive chambers, where investigators work by lamplight and magnification, the pattern resolves like a cogitator image coming into focus as static drains away. The correlation reveals systematic rather than accidental causation through accumulated weight of bureaucratic evidence. 6 weeks before the fire, Segmentum Command issued tithe acceleration orders with escalation codes appended, citing campaign necessities beyond local star charts. The order raised output targets by 12% and pulled forward delivery by 2 cycles. 2 days later, the governor's office translated strategy into arithmetic, throughput uplifts, shift extensions, maintenance windows compressed. The solvent deferral authorization traces directly to these segmentum demands, creating conditions where maintenance became discretionary expense, subject to elimination during periods of increased production pressure. Redundancy stripping appears throughout budget documents as efficiency improvement, cost-cutting measures that eliminated expensive safeguards while meeting output quotas through systematic reduction of safety margins. The Noosphere handshake protocol that might have prevented cascade failure was dismantled node by node, as administrators treated technological redundancy as luxury rather than essential safeguard. The same packet that authorized solvent rationing also approved cannibalization of 2 handshake repeaters to return a Medicaid rig to service after a Noble's accident, with notation that replacement nodes would be requisitioned next quarter when credits stabilized. They did not stabilize. The volunteer classifications that appeared throughout procurement documentation mask systematic coercion through debt court manipulation and engineered scarcity. Case files reveal how citizens facing impossible debt burdens received offers of labor commutation that presented voluntary servitude as merciful alternative to imprisonment, while omitting disclosure that neural modification would eliminate capacity for future choice. The numbers line up too neatly with requisition shortfalls to be coincidence. A sudden spike in voluntary submissions, coinciding precisely with periods of increased tithe demands, reveals the calculus becomes transparent once investigators know where to look. Most damning is the security report documenting Jorik Hess's death, clinical language that transforms desperate mercy into criminal sabotage through administrative categorization. The personnel logs yield their own quiet devastation. His execution enters records as security maintenance, a category reserved for disposal of dangerous assets during disturbances. The kill phrase that allowed his wife one moment of recognition becomes Exhibit 19B, unauthorized interaction with Imperial property. His habitation file is tagged for reassignment to lower heat housing. The tape in his cuff becomes evidence of seditious intent rather than humanitarian intervention. These documents reveal the fundamental inversion that exposes every piece of rhetoric used to justify servitor creation throughout Imperial history. The primary reframe crystallizes with chilling clarity. Servitors are not emergency measures implemented during crisis or humanitarian alternatives to execution. They are core policy instruments that convert deficit into compliant bodies through systematic application of bureaucratic violence. The technology serves as deliberate method for transforming human consciousness into industrial capacity, while preserving fiction of merciful intervention through theological blessing and legal procedure. Efficiency becomes creed through accumulated weight of administrative precedent that treats human consciousness as renewable resource subject to extraction according to Imperial requirements. The mathematics prove elegant in their brutality. Each servitor represents solved problem in the great equation of Imperial logistics, labor shortage converted into compliance through surgical intervention that eliminates capacity for resistance while preserving biological function. Casualties become sacrament through theological framework that transforms systematic dehumanization into spiritual necessity, presenting violation as purification and slavery as service to higher purpose. The trail leads back through archive layers to marginalia and cross-references that reveal Edict Theta's original author. The name resurfaces from truncations and honorifics scattered throughout administrative correspondence. The same hand whose theories now govern manufactoria across the Imperium. His forgotten paper from the Collegia archives emerges as footnote that exposes the true purpose of Cortex leash compliance when read alongside audit findings. The thesis proves clinical in its assessment of human behavior during crisis, treating psychological responses to trauma as engineering problems requiring technological solutions. The author writes about crowds, about throughput, about maintaining order through ensuring that nothing ever appears to stop. Panic spreads when motion ceases. Therefore, ensure machines always move, lines always feed, order always appears maintained. He proposes patterned broadcasts to smooth discontinuities in the civic field so that eyes see continuous function regardless of human cost. Neural leash refreshment appears as beneficial side effect rather than primary purpose. The edict's true concern was never the servitors, but the minds that might watch them fail. When this paper sits beside the audit of dead and burned and shut down, the rhetoric of mercy collapses entirely. The system achieves precisely what it was built to achieve: uninterrupted motion, predictable conversion, clean lines on balance sheets, and somewhere far away, a segmentum commander who need not adjust campaign maps. The tragedy of Manufactorum Tertius was not accident, but predictable outcome of system working exactly as designed, pushed to its logical conclusion. The Administratum Triune closes its report with recommendations that read like absolution and entrenchment simultaneously. Restore 2 handshake nodes where possible. Tighten oversight on lubricant stocks. Reaffirm edict theta compliance drills to reduce broadcast lapses. Maintain solvent discipline during future uplifts. Responsibility is assigned to processes, not persons. The system protects itself by consuming small sacrifices to preserve illusion of flawless design. Yorik's name appears nowhere that memory can hold. Yet the audit reveals how this systematic dehumanization operates through willful ignorance rather than coordinated malice, each department maintaining moral distance through bureaucratic procedure, while contributing to machinery that converts human consciousness into industrial capacity. The procurement coordinator acted within budget parameters. The tech adept followed sacred protocols. The magistrate offered legal alternatives, satisfying regulatory requirements. The accumulated effect creates perfect violation while maintaining fiction of merciful intervention. The ecclesiarchy's theological framework provides crucial infrastructure for this systematic dehumanization, but their contribution extends beyond rhetoric into practical participation through specialized conversion processes. Their sermons launder policy through penitence, teaching those who suffer to call suffering a gift while providing moral justification for continued extraction. If punishment has become function and suffering transformed into service, what becomes of redemption when the Church itself participates in systematic violation of human dignity? The Church has always had an answer to the weakness of flesh, theological solutions that embrace, rather than merely justify, systematic dehumanization through technological intervention. Across the Imperium, another form of servitor walks, one forged not by the Mechanicus's surgical tools, but by the ecclesiarchy's unwavering dogma, where pain itself is wired into service and redemption is measured by how completely flesh can be made to obey. It looks like penance. It sounds like prayer. It moves when trigger words are spoken. The Church has always had an answer to the weakness of flesh, and it sounds like screaming. Where the audit trail ends in bureaucratic absolution, theological necessity begins through conversion processes that embrace rather than eliminate human suffering. In cathedral manufactories across the Imperium, where incense mingles with industrial lubricants and hymns echo over production schedules, the CSI Ecclesiarchy operates its own transformation facilities that serve identical functions to Mechanicus servitor creation, while maintaining crucial theological distinctions that justify systematic dehumanization through different prayers. The rite of the Arco Whip represents the ecclesiarchy's answer to imperial labor requirements, a process that preserves consciousness specifically to ensure it suffers while serving practical security needs. Where Mechanicus doctrine teaches that flesh is weak and requires improvement through mechanical purification, ecclesiarchy theology embraces a darker truth. Sin must burn in service, and the burning must never end. This fundamental difference shapes every aspect of conversion, creating beings that retain enough awareness to understand their condition while remaining powerless to resist their programming. The condemned arrive at cathedral conversion chambers through theological evaluation, determining that certain transgressions require purification through perpetual suffering rather than merciful execution or cortex leash installation. In consecrated surgical theatres beneath the Cathedral of St. Drusus, chirurgeon priests bearing ecclesiarchy sanction install neural interfaces designed to amplify rather than suppress human consciousness. pain stimulators interface directly with nerve clusters throughout the modified body, creating feedback loops that transform movement into agony while making stillness impossible. Rage inducers flood modified brain chemistry with compounds that eliminate fear while amplifying aggressive responses, creating beings capable of inhuman violence while remaining aware of every action they perform under chemical compulsion. The technology differs fundamentally from Mechanicus servitor creation in its deliberate preservation of awareness and emotional response. Electrodes implanted into muscle groups trigger uncontrolled spasms, synchronized to trigger words spoken by confessors who once offered absolution but now dispense agony with sacramental precision. Chemical reservoirs connected to bloodstream release psychostimulants and aggressive hormones that strip away higher reasoning while leaving pain receptors fully functional. The converted sinner retains enough consciousness to remember their crimes, to recognize faces of family members, to experience the full weight of theological justice delivered through technological means that ensure punishment continues indefinitely. A case study from the cathedral's Arco Ward program reveals the economic efficiency of ecclesiarchy conversion practices through examination of reliquary protection services. 12 converted heretics guard sacred relics in rotating shifts that never end, their pain-stimulated consciousness ensuring perfect vigilance while their rage-enhanced capabilities provide security exceeding normal human limitations. The ward program generates sufficient revenue through pilgrimage fees and indulgence sales to fund expansion into adjacent sectors, creating self-sustaining cycles where theological necessity produces practical benefit that justifies continued conversion of condemned sinners. In the gift nave, donation boxes list costs of sanctified oils and ampoules, beside indulgence tariffs for prayers of maintenance. A family buys a candle. A guild pays for a month's worth of restraints. A syndicate endows an entire ward and has its crest etched into trigger plates for posterity. The budget balances without recourse to administratum allotment, scrip through direct monetization of suffering disguised as spiritual commerce. Pilgrims observe arco-flagellants patrolling cathedral grounds, in chains that sing with each movement, their modified voices reciting penitential prayers, while pain stimulators ensure every word emerges through genuine suffering. Families of ecclesial converts rarely receive compensation comparable to Mechanicus systems because church doctrine frames suffering as spiritually necessary rather than economically productive. A mother whose son was taken during under-hive disturbances seeks the scrip office and learns there is no account for ecclesial sentences. Her son belongs to the emperor's mercy now, and mercy does not pay rent. She receives a ribbon to tie to cathedral railings and the chance to purchase oil in his name. When she sees him again, he guards a shrine, kneeling under chains that move with his breath. She whispers his name, and a novice pulls her back with a smile, explaining that they must not disturb his penance. This creates profound institutional contradiction that reveals the ecclesiarchy's sophisticated capacity for theological flexibility when practical requirements conflict with doctrinal purity. Sermons condemn tech heresy and mechanical modification of human form as violations of the emperor's design, yet the same confessors who deliver these homilies also oversee arco-flagellant conversion facilities, employing identical technologies for different theological purposes. The distinction becomes semantic rather than substantial. Blessed augmetics serving divine will, while cursed modifications corrupt human essence according to interpretations that shift with institutional requirements. The public witnesses justice that contributes to imperial output while purging sin through agony. Theological theater that transforms systematic dehumanization into moral spectacle. The faithful observe these displays of divine justice and purchase indulgences that fund continued operations, creating economic cycles where spiritual comfort depends on perpetual torment of converted sinners. The contradiction extends to recruitment practices, mirroring Mechanicus procurement methods while maintaining theological distinction through different justifications. Church tribunals discover remarkable consistency in diagnostic capabilities during periods of increased security requirements, identifying heretical tendencies and spiritual corruption with precision correlating suspiciously with arco-flagellant replacement schedules. Different imperial factions compete for bodies through theological justification, presenting their methods as uniquely necessary while condemning alternative approaches as heretical deviation. The Mechanicus claims exclusive authority over flesh-machine integration through sacred knowledge recovered from Mars, while the ecclesiarchy asserts theological precedence in matters of sin and redemption, requiring spiritual rather than mechanical intervention. Both institutions process human consciousness into imperial assets while maintaining doctrinal purity through careful manipulation of language and procedure that obscures identical outcomes beneath different prayers. Administrative competition creates gray areas where jurisdictional boundaries blur, and procurement practices operate through informal agreements, maximizing efficiency while preserving theological distinction. A heretic condemned by church tribunal might undergo Mechanicus servitor conversion if technical skills prove valuable, while a criminal facing administratum processing could transfer to ecclesiarchy custody if theological evaluation discovers spiritual corruption requiring specialized treatment. The same authorization documents move bodies between institutional systems according to practical requirements rather than doctrinal consistency. This institutional competition reveals how systematic dehumanization operates through market mechanisms, treating human consciousness as commodity subject to procurement, according to supply and demand, rather than moral considerations. The result is systematic conversion operating through multiple channels, presenting different theological justifications for identical outcomes, whether consciousness is eliminated through cortex leash installation or preserved through pain stimulator activation to serve imperial requirements, while families learn to accept loss through different forms of institutional comfort. Where law ends, markets begin. The demand for obedient bodies exceeds supply of sanctioned conversions in every busy system, and jurisdictional edges blur under pressure from practical necessity competing with regulatory purity. Off-ledger transfers move through sacristies during night shifts, their paperwork carrying familiar stamps with inks that dry too fast and lines that smudge under scrutiny. The sanctifying stamp appears again, no longer device of chancery alone, but commodity sold in shadow chapels and sigil guild back rooms to anyone requiring conversion, laundered into piety through counterfeit authorization, bearing sacred seals beside forged administrative marks that transform theft into inventory without courtesy of him or legal protection. The sanctifying stamp appears again in shadow commerce, its sacred geometry reproduced in workshops where the same sigil grey/omega that once transformed citizens into inventory now serves as commodity traded through networks that feed servitor demand beyond official channels. Behind broken vending machines and shrine closets, where incense covers the smell of cut plastic and forbidden knowledge, rogue scriveners operate die presses that reproduce authorization with precision matching official templates, their forgeries indistinguishable from genuine stamps except for microscopic variations, detectable only through laboratory analysis that no one requests when quotas must be met. Battlefield recovery crews operate the primary contraband pipeline through medical transports that return from combat zones, with manifests never quite balancing against casualty reports filed through separate administrative channels. A corpsman tags casualties as deceased while loading still-breathing bodies into unmarked containers, their trauma sufficient to justify cognitive compromise assessments, while preserving biological function necessary for industrial conversion. Field Medicare units maintain 2 sets of records: official casualty reports satisfying administrative requirements, while shadow manifests track actual cargo loads destined for processing facilities existing in jurisdictional blind spots between imperial authorities. The economics prove elegant in their brutality. Triage protocols expand definitions of terminal injury to include cases that might recover with proper intervention, but prove more valuable as biological raw materials than patients requiring expensive rehabilitation. A trooper with severe head trauma disappears from official records, while his cortex-compatible brain stem enters black market networks, where human consciousness trades like any other imperial commodity subject to supply and demand calculations. The dead receive proper burial rites, while the technically living vanish into processing chains that transform combat trauma into industrial capacity through systematic harvesting of the psychologically damaged. Scrivener guilds provide administrative infrastructure necessary to launder stolen bodies into legitimate inventory through document fraud operating at industrial scale. Guild workshops reproduce sigil grey/omega impressions with precision that transforms theft into authorized procurement through proper paperwork, bearing sacred seals beside administrative marks. The same authorization documents that once carried weight of law now serve as commodities sold to networks requiring conversion, legitimized through bureaucratic procedure, creating parallel systems that mirror official channels while operating beyond regulatory oversight. In a factor's office, with shutters painted to resemble stained glass, guild masters offer different products to different buyers. A rogue magos purchases authentic stamp impressions from corrupt scriveners, then reproduces them in quantities sufficient to authorize entire shipments of reconditioned servitors bearing burned serial numbers and modified programming. The die strikes fast, and, clean against vellum pulled from damp crates, ink spreading into paper fibers with the same mechanical precision that governs the consciousness it authorizes for extraction. Rogue magi complete the circuit through retasking operations that modify servitor programming to serve private interests while maintaining appearance of regulatory compliance. In maintenance bays smelling of rust and stolen incense, tech adepts with too many augments to pass for legitimate practitioners move styluses through cortex harnesses and decouple units from Edict Theta refresh schedules. The changes appear small in code, but prove vast in consequence, creating servitors that answer to private voxcasters instead of manufactorum bells, while bypassing official maintenance protocols that might detect unauthorized modifications. Rogue trader Mordian Kess operates through these shadow channels, his acquisition of reconditioned porter servitors illustrating how wealth purchases silence while corruption becomes operational overhead priced into Imperial logistics. At Dawn Pier 5, his procurement agent examines 12 units offered through off-ledger networks, their original designations acid-etched into anonymity, while new programming installs task loops suitable for void ship operations. The units retain mechanical competence while losing administrative history, their consciousness reduced to cargo handling protocols that serve private enterprise rather than imperial requirements. The transaction occurs in warehouse districts, where administratum oversight maintains polite fiction of ignorance, investigators arriving precisely late enough to discover empty spaces and cleaned floors, while filing reports noting suspicious activity requiring further monitoring at unspecified future dates. Payment flows through banking networks designed to obscure financial connections, credits transforming into favors, and favors becoming authorizations that legitimize theft through bureaucratic alchemy. The porter servitors load onto his vessel with mechanical precision, their modified consciousness serving private interests while their original families continue receiving allotment scrip payments calculated according to productivity metrics measuring efficiency of stolen labor. Administratum audits recognize these shadow markets, but treat corruption as operational overhead rather than criminal enterprise requiring aggressive prosecution. Internal memoranda acknowledge that off-ledger procurement meets demand that official channels cannot satisfy while maintaining plausible deniability through administrative procedures, distributing responsibility across departments. The same officials who authorize crackdowns on contraband networks also approve budget allocations, assuming certain percentages of servitor inventory will disappear into shadow commerce, creating institutional incentives that encourage rather than prevent systematic theft. The poor purchase extended function through illegal recalibration services offered by back-alley magi who modify programming to reduce degradation rates while maintaining appearance of compliance. A widow whose husband operates lifting servos discovers that unauthorized maintenance can extend his functional lifespan from 2 years to 4 meaningful increase for families whose economic stability depends on continued servitor uptime. She pays in scrip worth less tomorrow than today, the modifications violating Mechanicus doctrine, but remaining undetectable through standard inspection protocols. The wealthy purchase different services entirely. Guild heirs with relatives facing reduction dockets pay scriveners to misfile names and substitute debtors without sponsors, producing consents never signed, while volunteers appear on paper who never met human hands. Noble houses requiring discrete labor solutions contract through intermediaries, who provide servitors bearing proper authorization while maintaining operational distance from procurement methods, their credits flowing through networks ensuring inconvenient questions remain unasked, while problematic documentation disappears into archive vaults. These markets pay off earlier revelations about volunteer classifications through systematic examination of documentation fraud. Investigation reveals that volunteer submissions often exist only on paper, families coerced through engineered scarcity, while shadow markets provide bodies to meet quotas through document forgery rather than actual consent. The same procurement networks claiming humanitarian motivation operate through systematic manipulation of legal frameworks that transform desperation into authorization while maintaining fiction of voluntary compliance through proper paperwork bearing authentic seals. The market's logic mirrors the Imperium's fundamental approach: output above personhood, efficiency above dignity, function above consciousness. Quotas are met through whatever channels prove most efficient, whether through official authorization or shadow market acquisition, the outcome identical regardless of theological distinctions or administrative procedures. Bodies flow toward demand with mechanical precision that treats human consciousness as renewable resource subject to extraction according to imperial requirements rather than moral considerations. The shadow commerce links directly to the Night of Green Light through examination of retasked units whose illegal modifications bypassed official protocols and contributed to cascade failure. Several servitors operating in Manufactorum Tertius bore signs of unauthorized recalibration, their neural programming modified to extend operational lifespans, while creating vulnerabilities that official maintenance would have detected and corrected. When power grid failure eliminated Edict Theta broadcasts, these modified units responded differently to emergency conditions, their illegal programming creating feedback loops that amplified disaster through interactions between authorized and unauthorized systems. The same underground networks that extend servitor lifespans also introduce programming inconsistencies that destabilize cluster coordination when multiple systems reach critical thresholds simultaneously. Illegal modifications serve humanitarian purposes while creating conditions for technological breakdown. The accumulated small changes appearing harmless in isolation, but generating catastrophic interactions during crisis events, when emergency protocols fail to account for unauthorized system variations. Legal boundaries blur further when examining warfront deployment, where campaign necessities create demand exceeding supply of sanctioned conversions. Military commanders acquire servitors through whatever channels provide necessary capabilities, regardless of authorization status, the same units serving private interests during peacetime, transferring to military service during mobilization through emergency procedures that prioritize throughput over regulatory purity. On campaign, governors answer only to throughput requirements while maintaining operational distance from procurement methods, and the mathematics of war reduce human consciousness to tactical assets measured in operational capability rather than moral consideration. The kill phrases that promise safety through technological control take on different meaning when deployed against enemies who might capture and reprogram Imperial servitors. Emergency shutdown procedures becoming weapons that destroy Imperial assets to prevent hostile use, while raising questions about whether these protocols save Imperial lives through tactical advantage or destroy them through systematic elimination of captured personnel who might otherwise survive as prisoners rather than property. The shadow commerce that transforms stolen mines into inventory finds its ultimate expression on the warfront, where legal boundaries dissolve under the pressure of tactical necessity, and demand outpaces supply with brutal mathematics. On campaign, governors answer only to throughput requirements, while maintaining operational distance from procurement methods, creating conditions where off-ledger servitors acquired through contraband networks transfer seamlessly into military service through emergency authorizations that prioritize capability over documentation purity. The same retasked units that once served criminal enterprises in underhive sectors now advance through killing fields with mechanical precision, their questionable origins overlooked in the face of urgent need for expendable labor, immune to fear or tactical hesitation. Siege worlds deploy combat servitors by the thousand in configurations optimized for expendability rather than preservation. Their stolen consciousness serving tactical requirements that reduce human cost to mathematical variables measured in operational capability rather than individual dignity. Shield-bearers advance in perfect formation through artillery barrages that would shatter human morale, their reinforced carapaces absorbing enemy fire, while biological components fail under sustained damage. Behind them, breacher mules carry explosive charges through defensive networks with hydraulic limbs designed to clear obstacles regardless of personal survival. Their modified consciousness focused on target acquisition rather than self-preservation instincts that might compromise mission success. Gun platforms represent the ultimate fusion of human reflexes and mechanical precision, modified torsos chained to weapon systems under direct tech-marine control through neural interfaces that bypass higher cognitive functions entirely. A former scrivener whose eyes once tracked ledger columns now calculates firing solutions with inhuman accuracy, her consciousness reduced to ballistic computation, while her modified respiratory system cycles coolant through weapon barrels that grow hot under sustained fire. The targeting protocols operate through augmetic sensory arrays, calibrated for specific threat profiles, while retaining human pattern recognition capabilities that exceed pure mechanical systems, creating beings capable of delivering lethal force with precision impossible for unaugmented personnel operating under combat stress. Imperial Guard Medica units employ surgical servitors, bearing sanctified bone saws and dulled pain receptors, their modified hands performing field surgery with precision impossible for human medics operating under bombardment. These units process wounded personnel with mechanical efficiency that prioritizes throughput over comfort, their consciousness programmed to recognize medical necessity rather than human suffering. A chirurgeon servitor whose hands once comforted sick children now performs amputations without anesthesia while reciting medical protocols in place of lullabies, her modified voice offering clinical assessment rather than emotional comfort to patients whose screams register only as ambient noise requiring filtration. Battlefield conditions create technological vulnerabilities that peacetime protocols never anticipated, environmental hazards that corrupt servitor programming through electromagnetic interference exceeding design parameters. During the Mordian Iron Guard's assault on Hive Secundus, orbital bombardment generates electromagnetic pulses that interfere with target recognition protocols, causing 37 gun platform servitors to identify Imperial uniforms as hostile signatures according to corrupted data processing. Their modified brains cannot distinguish from accurate sensor input. The incident unfolds with mechanical precision as weapons pivot toward advancing Imperial forces and begin systematic elimination of their own side through targeting protocols, interpreting friendly signatures as enemy contacts. Kill phrases ripple through formation Vox networks as Tech Marines broadcast emergency shutdown commands, while Imperial Guard units dive for cover from weapons fire delivered with inhuman accuracy by beings who once shared their humanity. Tech adept Valerius Keth, who programmed the failsafe protocols, fumbles the cipher through gloves slick with someone else's blood, retches behind his rebreather mask, then finds the cadence and broadcasts the alphanumeric string that transforms protection into termination. One by one, weapons drop silent as neural circuits receive shutdown authorization and biological functions cease with the same efficiency that governed their military service. He logs successful mitigation under correct doctrine, while the dead Imperial Guardsmen become acceptable losses in calculations, measuring technological success through crisis management rather than prevention. The kill phrases that promise safety through technological control reveal their true nature as weapons that destroy Imperial assets to prevent hostile use. Emergency procedures that save tactical advantage while eliminating captured personnel who might otherwise survive as prisoners rather than property. The mathematics prove brutal in their clarity. Speaking those words preserves operational security, while ensuring that former citizens converted into servitors face execution rather than rescue, their consciousness extinguished through merciful intervention disguised as security protocol. Space Marines employ servo-automata with different philosophical approach that treats former humans as tools rather than corrupted kin. Their enhanced physiology and psychological conditioning eliminating emotional responses that compromise tactical efficiency. Astartes view servitor deployment through purely utilitarian lens, measuring capability against expendability without sentiment for the consciousness that once inhabited modified flesh. Yet their Chapter Forge Masters hoard maintenance supplies like sacred relics while implementing triple redundancy protocols that exceed Mechanicus standard requirements, understanding that tool effectiveness depends on perfect function when imperfection means death. War strips away peacetime luxuries like proper maintenance schedules and quality control protocols, creating conditions where servitor deployment operates according to emergency procedures, treating biological components as consumable resources subject to planned obsolescence. Field repairs become exercises in scavenging and improvisation, cannibalizing one unit to keep 3 operational, while daubing blessed oils across seals that should have been replaced sectors ago, because transport ships carry shells rather than spare parts. The purity scourge becomes memory when solvents are rationed for weapons cleaning, creating conditions where biofilm accumulation reaches critical thresholds during sustained operations. Statistical analysis reveals the elegant brutality of battlefield mathematics through casualty rates that justify servitor deployment over human personnel in situations requiring absolute compliance with potentially fatal orders. Servitor losses reach 93% during sustained assault operations, acceptable attrition rates for units designed for expendability rather than survival, while human casualties average 47% under identical conditions. The numbers create tactical incentives that favor modified consciousness over thinking beings capable of fear or tactical assessment that might compromise mission success through hesitation or self-preservation instincts. Shadow market units bleed into military operations through emergency authorizations that make jurisdiction irrelevant when quotas must be met regardless of documentation purity. Retasked servitors bearing burned serial numbers and modified programming arrive with Cortex leash codes incompatible with theater patterns, creating vulnerabilities that manifest during crisis events when unauthorized modifications interact with official protocols in unpredictable ways. On Hill 103, 2 illicit porter servitors running pirate cipher frequencies failed to receive stand-down orders and marched through artillery barrages. Their modified consciousness interpreted as environmental noise, their illegal programming creating feedback loops that contributed to cascade failure when emergency protocols could not account for unauthorized system variations. As conflicts end and siege lines dissolve into administrative boundaries, broken units face final protocol through reclamation procedures that recover useful materials while disposing of biological waste according to established procedures designed to maximize resource recovery while maintaining fiction of respectful disposal. Victory celebrations include ceremonial termination of damaged servitors whose service has concluded, their consciousness finally extinguished through merciful intervention, while their augmetic components enter salvage streams, feeding future conversions. Reclamation teams move through battlefield graveyards with mechanical precision, sorting damaged servitors according to component value, while biological remains enter processing systems designed to transform human waste into useful materials. Sacred oils anoint the work, while hymns invoke blessing upon resource recovery that converts death into input for future operations, theological framework presenting systematic dismantling as spiritual necessity rather than economic convenience. What remains when function ends and the machine stops is not memory or dignity, but inventory, biological components processed according to specifications that measure utility in grams and kilograms, rather than years and relationships that once gave meaning to consciousness, now reduced to raw materials. Reclamation was a legal footnote in imperial jurisprudence, administrative requirement buried in regulatory appendices that most officials never examine. In practice, it feeds the city through systematic recovery of human materials disguised as sacred ritual, processing chains that transform battlefield casualties into protein supplements and construction materials, while maintaining fiction of spiritual respect through proper blessing and ceremonial disposal. The appetite is vast, and the supply is endless, each campaign generating mountains of biological waste that once walked and spoke and dreamed, now converted into resources that sustain the same imperial machinery that created them through systematic violation of everything that once made them human. The battlefield graveyards empty into reclamation halls, where the final stage of servitor existence unfolds with the same bureaucratic precision that governed their conversion and deployment. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings, inscribed with the binary cant of Mars, legal footnotes become industrial doctrine through the reclamation rite that separates sacred components from consumable materials according to specifications measuring utility rather than dignity. The air carries iron and antiseptic in equal measure, mixed with the sharper scent of solvents finally being spent after months of deferral, chemical compounds that might have preserved function during life, now serving to dissolve consciousness into constituent elements. Tech priests in crimson robes move between disassembly stations with ritual precision, their augmetic limbs clicking against blessed instruments, while Binharic hymns echo from vox grills mounted above workbenches stained with fluids that once carried human dreams through modified veins. Each unit receives inventory assessment before processing, serial numbers checked against manifests that survived fire and administrative oversight, while blessed chisels separate augmetic assemblies from flesh with practiced strikes measured by caliper and catechism. The separation process follows established protocols distinguishing between sacred components requiring preservation and biological waste suitable for rendering into useful materials. Augmetic limbs, neural interfaces, and cortex leash assemblies receive careful extraction through procedures that preserve functionality for refit into future conversions, hydraulic servos, and cranial ports cleaned with sanctified solvents before storage in reliquaries marked with purity seals and inventory codes. The technology that once transformed citizens into property awaits redistribution to new bodies requiring mechanical improvement according to Imperial requirements, each component blessed and catalogued for later use while maintaining fiction that systematic cannibalization serves spiritual rather than economic purposes. Biological remains flow through different processing chains designed to extract maximum utility from human waste through systematic breakdown that converts flesh into protein supplement and bone into construction materials. Tissue processors render muscle and organ matter into bioslurry distributed through ration networks, its origin obscured through chemical treatment and theological blessing that presents recycled flesh as emperor-blessed sustenance rather than cannibalism disguised through industrial procedure. Bone material undergoes calcification, processing producing shrine lime for construction projects, calcium phosphate that once supported human hopes now serving as mortar-binding cathedral walls and manufactorum foundations, where future servitors will toil in endless cycles. The skulls receive special treatment through servo-skull conversion procedures that preserve cranial structure while installing vox units and suspensor arrays, creating floating reliquaries serving ceremonial and practical functions throughout the Imperial hierarchy. In surgical chambers beneath the reclamation facility, chirurgeon priests hollow cranial cavities with blessed tools while installing communication equipment that transforms human skulls into speaking devices capable of broadcasting recorded messages or real-time communications. This is the payoff to our second open loop from the beginning. The mouth finally prays, wired to vox units singing litanies over ledgers and quotas rather than offering comfort or expressing human emotion. Unit 57-92 F undergoes final processing 4 days after the night of green light, her skull selected for servo-skull conversion, while her biological remains enter standard reclamation streams. The chirurgeon priest notes excellent bone density and minimal trauma scarring, qualities making her cranium suitable for ceremonial applications, requiring aesthetic appeal alongside functional capability. Her voice patterns, preserved in cortex leash memory buffers, provide audio samples for vox unit programming, allowing her skull to speak with recognizable intonation while delivering messages programmed by users rather than expressing thoughts she no longer possesses. Resource economics reveal cruel efficiency in systems designed to extract maximum utility from human materials through procedures converting waste into input for new cycles of conversion and consumption. The solvents saved during life through deferred purity scourge maintenance find purpose in death through chemical processing that breaks down biological components into constituent elements, the same compounds that might have extended servitor lifespans, now serving to dissolve tissues into manageable slurry suitable for protein synthesis. The mathematics prove elegant in their brutality. Each decision to defer maintenance during operational life, creating chemical stockpiles that facilitate processing after function ends, while demonstrating how every economy of imperial efficiency extracts compound interest from human suffering. Illegal workshops operate parallel reclamation networks, diverting components to grey markets through systematic theft disguised as administrative error. Rogue tech adepts cannibalizing valuable augmetics while substituting inferior replacements or filing reports claiming components were damaged beyond recovery. Forged Sigil Grey/Omega stamps legitimize new origins for recycled parts through document fraud, transforming stolen components into authorized inventory bearing proper certification. The same authorization marks that once converted citizens into property now serving to launder theft into legitimate commerce. The stamps appear on manifests documenting component origins, while obscuring actual procurement methods through bureaucratic procedures, protecting participants from examining moral implications of systematic material recovery, disguised as sacred duty. Families sometimes receive reliquary fragments through notification procedures, presenting material recovery as spiritual comfort rather than economic transaction. Small pieces of blessed bone or metal components returned to next of kin, alongside certificates documenting sacred processing according to established protocols. More often, they receive standardized notifications stating that reclamation was complete and blessed, administrative communications providing closure without material compensation while avoiding specific details about processing methods that might disturb civilian morale or create administrative complications requiring additional paperwork. In the governor's ceremonial hall, where portraits of imperial heroes line walls beneath stained glass windows depicting the emperor's glory, Unit 57-92F serves her final function as talking reliquary floating beside the throne, where Planetary Governor Vaughn receives petitions from citizens seeking administrative relief. Her skull bears servo-skull modifications, preserving her voice patterns, while installing programming that recites production statistics and efficiency metrics in response to vocal commands, her consciousness extinguished while her physical remains serve decorative and practical functions simultaneously. She speaks with intonation patterns that once comforted her husband during difficult times, but the words emerge from programming rather than memory, production numbers flowing through vocal cords that once whispered endearments and sang lullabies to children who will never hear their mother's voice again, except as administrative tool serving bureaucratic convenience. Jorik lies buried in salt beneath level 43, his body processed through standard reclamation, but deemed unsuitable for servo-skull conversion due to trauma damage from the Skitarius weapon that terminated his sabotage attempt. His remains contribute to bioslurry production, while his wife's skull floats in ceremonial splendor. The same voice that once spoke his name, now reciting quotas with empty precision, serving imperial efficiency, while eliminating every trace of human connection that once gave meaning to their shared existence. The governor activates her Vox unit during audiences with manufacturing guild representatives, her familiar voice delivering throughput, calculations, and resource allocation data with mechanical precision that impresses visitors while demonstrating imperial efficiency through technological innovation that transforms love into logistics. The machine consumes, binds, breaks, and grinds in endless cycles, transforming human consciousness into imperial assets through systematic procedures, presenting violation as purification and slavery as service to higher purpose. Each stage receives theological blessing while serving practical requirements, reducing human dignity to economic calculation, creating systems where death becomes input for continued operations rather than conclusion of individual existence. Reclamation represents the final stage of systematic dehumanization, the moment when stolen consciousness completes its transformation into useful materials serving the same imperial machinery that authorized its extraction through bureaucratic procedures disguised as mercy and necessity. What creed makes this systematic horror acceptable to billions of imperial citizens who witness servitor labor daily, while participating in economic systems dependent on stolen consciousness converted into industrial capacity? The answer lies not in single doctrine, but in accumulated weight of institutional momentum that transforms individual tragedy into bureaucratic routine, creating conditions where communities normalize systematic dehumanization through willful ignorance protected by proper procedure and authorized blessing. What debt does a historian owe to the dead who still work, whose consciousness was stolen, and whose remains serve imperial efficiency, while their families learn to accept loss through administrative comfort and economic dependence? The obligation extends beyond documentation to examination of how systematic violation operates through mechanisms that make complicity inevitable, while preserving fiction of moral purity through theological justification and bureaucratic distance that allows atrocity to become sacrament through proper authorization and sacred ritual. The servo skull that once carried a mother's voice completes its circuit through the governor's hall, suspenser whining softly as it reports quotas and output in a cadence that used to be lullabies. It is the same instrument we followed into the reclamation halls and back again, a loop closed with bureaucratic elegance. What began with a stamp ends with a floating relic, and in between lies an economy that turns deficits into bodies with the predictability of tide. This transformation completes a process we have traced through 14 chapters of systematic documentation, revealing how individual tragedy becomes institutional necessity through what can only be called policy physics, the inevitable conversion of human deficits into mechanical assets. The Imperium does not merely employ servitors as emergency measures or humanitarian alternatives to execution. They represent the core operating system by which besieged empire maintains function, running on broken minds in stolen bodies while preserving the fiction of moral purity through theological blessing and bureaucratic procedure. The economic mathematics prove elegant in their brutality. Servitors raise output everywhere they are chained to a line, while systematically suppressing wages, creating competitive advantages for facilities employing modified consciousness over unaugmented workers who require compensation, benefits, and accommodation for human needs that reduce efficiency. The presence of tireless labor eliminates bargaining power and renders strike something to endure rather than resolve. When crises arrive, governors can meet tithes with arrests faster than they can with reforms. Procurement schedules convert downturns into supply for forge temples, then record the extraction as administrative prudence. The calculus sustains itself because it works with mechanical precision. A Prometheum shortfall demands a convoy. A labor shortfall demands signatures. Pressure flows along channels policy built, and those channels end at the right of reduction. The audit records from Manufactorum Tertius, once sanitized by bureaucratic language, now reveal the precise financial calculus: solvents saved, units gained, tithes met, all at the cost of human lives reduced to line items in ledgers that measure efficiency through elimination of everything that once made those lives meaningful. This is not aberration, but policy physics, the predictable flow of pressure through systems designed to channel human consciousness toward industrial conversion. The psychological cost accrues on the other side of the ledger, where no one keeps books. Communities learn to speak a new grammar in which grief has no subject, only objects in motion. Children are taught to greet servo skulls by name and call it prayer, because everyone around them does. Their conversations with dead relatives processed through Vox units, programmed to deliver comforting responses, while eliminating every trace of consciousness that once inhabited modified craniums. Allotment scrip appears each month like weather, its green bands more intimate than sunlight. Families talk about uptime, like sailors talk about wind, measuring love through productivity statistics rather than human connection. They watch maintenance calendars the way they once watched moons. A mother teaches her child to count the chimes of the shift bell and to listen for the theta cadence. A father lowers his voice when he says unit and means wife. Habit makes atrocity survivable, then habit makes it invisible. The language itself becomes a system, and systems are hard to feel wrong from inside. Memory remains local, unofficial, and costly. The system requires it that way to function without psychological resistance that might compromise efficiency through emotional attachment to consciousness scheduled for extraction. Institutions preserve this arrangement by carving their jurisdictions into clean shapes and guarding them with piety, each maintaining moral distance through specialized ignorance, while contributing to collective violation that none could accomplish alone. The Mechanicus polices form over volume, ensuring that conversion procedures follow established protocols while avoiding examination of procurement methods that supply bodies for sacred improvement. If the seals are affixed and the litanies complete, then the ledger of their conscience is closed. They prosecute heretics who splice code without benediction and walk past the ward where 100 stamped authorizations wait in trays of good ink. The administratum prices scandal into operational overhead rather than purging its cause. Its audits recognize leakage, retasking, and counterfeit stamps, then fold the expected losses into next quarter's forecast, while recommending procedural tightening that moves responsibility one bracket to the left. The same officials who authorize investigations into servitor trafficking also approve resource allocations, assuming certain percentages of inventory will disappear into grey markets, institutionalizing corruption while maintaining fiction of regulatory oversight. The ecclesiarchy labors where meaning is made, transforming harm into sacrament through sermons that present arco-wards as shrines and scrip acceptance as submission to divine economy. Their sermons turn pain into proof and penance into currency. And if an arco-ward sings through clenched teeth, the hymn only sounds more sincere. This creates capillary action where corruption is not an aberrant tumor, but the natural flow of fluid-finding paths the vessel encourages while officials profit by pretending surprise. The so-called safeguards reveal the core of the system through examination of how the Imperium externalizes risk onto emptied minds, while its safety mechanisms breed designed catastrophe. Edict Theta promised to keep panic from rippling through crowds by ensuring nothing ever looked like it had stopped. Broadcasts were less about obedience than about optics, civic sedative disguised as compliance. When the power dipped during the night of green light, the leash became momentum, mechanical persistence that recognized no limit or exception. Kill phrases are comfort for those who hold the ciphers. They shut down assets cleanly when Vox is clear and time is abundant. On the floor in green light, they arrive too late or all at once, and their mercy becomes indistinguishable from destruction. The purity scourge looks thrifty until it isn't. Every deferred purge accrues compound interest in heat and residue, and the payment comes due in fire when biofilm accumulation meets the inevitable crisis. Redundancy was the honest precaution, the noosphere handshake that let clusters average errors and bleed off peril. It is too expensive to keep and too costly to lose, and budgets decide which it will be. Everything we planted throughout. This investigation comes back into view with its edges sharpened by accumulated evidence. The sigil Grey/Omega that legalized forgetting now circulates as commodity in shadow markets, stamped truth spreading like ink through vellum until consent appears, wherever it must. The clause that promised voluntary submission still exists, kept polished by those wealthy enough to reach it while everyone else meets the right at the end of a debt docket or quota sheet. Scrip binds the living to the continued non-personhood of the taken, a stipend calibrated to make prayers align with output while creating perverse incentives where households pray for their loved ones' sustained enslavement. Reclamation's appendices, shelved as hygiene in legal archives, prove to be recipes for keeping the city fed and its walls standing through systematic recovery of human materials disguised as sacred ritual. The last turn of the screw in a system that wastes nothing and spares no one, converting battlefield casualties and industrial waste into protein supplements and construction materials, while servo-skull conversion preserves familiar voices for administrative convenience. The reframe we offered at the beginning settles into place without drama, because by now it reads like maintenance documentation. Servitors are not the exception deployed against emergency. They are the rule that makes emergency survivable. This is the Imperium's operating system, not an accessory, an empire designed to externalize risk onto emptied minds, while keeping the appearance of order for those who must believe in it. The institutions do not need to conspire to achieve this systematic dehumanization. They only need to do their jobs with care, and without imagination. The doctrinal lattice that makes this survivable to its operators rests on reframes we have now stripped to their steel. Mercy through function was never about the condemned. It was about the watchers. The line that must not halt is not the artery of a manufactorum alone, but the line on reports that says stability. The archive showed us the hand that wrote stability into law and called it liturgy. The manufactorum showed us what it purchases. The warfront showed us what it requires. Reclamation showed us how little of it is wasted. There is a debt in the work of describing such a machine, and it extends beyond documentation to moral obligation. It is easy to count tonnage, components, signatures with bureaucratic precision. It is harder to count what is missing. The conversations that will never happen, the lullabies that became production statistics, the recognition that flickered for an instant before the kill phrase completed its work. Precision is not absolution, when the ledger that matters will never balance, while the entry for person is replaced with part. Return to the manufactorum, if you like, because we all do in the end. The luminators falter, the emergency housings breathe out that medical green, and a mouth moves with a familiar rhythm. It shapes numbers because that is what it has been given to say, vocal cords that once whispered endearments, now serving imperial efficiency through mechanical precision. The edict purrs in the walls when it can. The scourge moves when budgets allow. The phrases that kill arrive clean in rooms with good vox. The stamp stays dry on its tray until a hand reaches for it without hesitation. Count what is missing, and ask who benefits when persons become parts, and why the machine never seems to run out of fuel. The skull makes another circuit in the hall and reports a tithe met on time, while someone nods and someone signs. The person is gone. The machine remains. This is cognitive closure without consolation, the sound of an empire that has learned to survive by consuming its own, and the constant hum we have followed throughout this investigation. The sound of the eternal engine whose fuel is everything that once made us human.